Welcome to the Fall Risk Conference webcast. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to when we can once again meet and enjoy the company of friends and peers. But for now, we're thankful to meet by means of this webcast. Our risk conference will have two sessions, one today and one Thursday. The Utah State Bar has approved 5 hours of continuing legal education for this conference. Please visit riskconference.net and provide your bar number to receive credit. There is also going to be a recorded portion available for rebroadcast after we complete the sessions today. Our first speaker this morning will be Dave Denniston. Dave Denniston is the Director of Risk Management for McNeil & Company and serves as Executive Director of the National Farm Medic Training Program. Dave has been in emergency services for over 30 years and is past chief of Cortlandville Fire Department in upstate New York. Dave will be presenting to us on emerging risk and claims trends impacting the fire services. We also invite everyone to submit your questions by means of the panel that you'll see to the side of your screen. And Dave will take a few minutes after his presentation to review questions. And if there's more questions than we have time, he's also provided his contact information where you can contact and review information directly with him. Thank you, Dave, for being part of our presentation today. And we look forward to the topic, It's Not the Fire That Will Burn You. Thanks, Dave.
Daryl, good morning, and thanks for everyone for joining us here. And I'll echo your comments in that we look forward to the time that we can be together again, but Zoom has certainly become a way of life for a lot of us, and we'll continue to move forward in this format until we can do things safer. So, well, thanks for being here, and again, spending some time with us this morning. And when I talk to folks in the fire service, I always ask them, what was your vision of the fire service? Were you excited? Were you nervous? Were you unsure of exactly what to expect? But what did that look like for you? And, as folks answer and we talk back to that, get conversations rolling, a lot of them are pretty excited and they're looking forward to, being able to train and doing something new. They're looking forward to, being able to drive the big apparatus. They're looking forward to obviously the calls that they'll go on and the challenges that they'll face, whether it's a big house fire, building fire, or something as simple as a car fire. Most of them are pretty excited to dive right into that field and get going with it. So when we again look at those things, the opportunities to man against machine, we call it, or to rip heavy metal, or even the unknown type calls that we'll go on to. This was a call that we went on. Was a milk tanker that had come down a hill, lost control, swung around sideways, slid off the road and into the side of this house. And I'm always interested when I look at this picture because I ask people, I go, well, what's the hazard here? What are we really looking at? And as you look at the group of people, most of them are, right around the cab of that tractor trailer. Obviously, there's somebody pinned inside there. And so many times we get tunnel vision as to what the dangers are and what we're looking at on some of these calls. But as you stand back and look at this picture and get a little bigger picture, all of a sudden you see the electric wires hanging down from the top of the house. I didn't even see it today on the scene, and it was probably a month or two afterwards looking at this picture that I realized the chimney had been knocked over and was laying on top of the roof of the house. What you can't see in the picture is there was actually a woman sleeping on the couch in the front corner of that room, and the couch had got pushed forward further into the room. She was not injured badly, luckily. But there was also a 100-pound propane tank that was sitting outside this house, which is now laying in the basement of that structure. So again, we look at the things that we go to, we try to figure out where those dangerous situations are. And it's not always obvious at first is what we're looking for. Everybody thinks about the big one, we call this, where, you've got a fire, you're taking a lot of resources, you're going to do a lot of things on the scene, and what's going to be involved there. And people are ready to handle those type of things. A lot of people look forward to the fun type events that come with it, the camaraderie and respecting our heritage. The chance to get physically fit with some other members of your organization, or even to show off your skills in some competition. A lot of people associate all of this stuff with the fire service and what we're looking at. You know, even some of the community events and the family time that we get to spend in the fire and EMS services is what we look forward to as well. So what we need to remind people and talk to them about sometimes, and in risk management, this is what we spend the majority of our time doing here, is, you know, making sure that people understand it's not all sunshine and rainbows. Everything that you expected when you took the job, everything that you expected when you became part of the service may not really be what you're doing on a daily basis. You know, we need people to understand you're going to spend countless hours waiting for those calls to come in. And sometimes it's that idle time that can get us in trouble as well. So, you know, I don't think anybody, when they became a firefighter or an EMT, really thought about, I'm going to have some downtime. What am I going to do to fill that time, and what's that look like? I don't think people realize that, you know, a lot of the time was going to be tough work, and then things away from the main excitement, if you will, of the situation. But we're going to spend a lot of time, and that's where we see a lot of our injuries, as well as, you know, maybe not the folks that are truly fighting the fire, but all these other things that are going around in the background that can be a danger and a detriment to us. You know, I think people understand we're going to spend some hours respecting our brothers and sisters. This picture happened to have been taken 2 years ago, but we did the same thing here a couple days ago, you know, remembering all the victims of 9/11. And it's certainly part of our heritage and who and what we do in the fire service. Whether we're honoring people, you know, on a national basis, then we start to recognize some names on the walls around there and folks that we join the service with. And then we start to really realize just how dangerous this profession can be. Unfortunately, sometimes it's going to be folks that we know that are injured or killed in the line of duty, and we have to deal with that as an organization. And sometimes it may be our own organization as well. So, you know, when we started the program, we said, what do people think about when they become a firefighter, they become an EMT, they become part of the service? And a lot of these things we don't really expect. And as we grow through the service, as we spend more time there, all of a sudden we realize what some of these things truly are. You know, I don't think anybody thought about spending time in a courtroom or having to defend the actions of what they did. And yet on a regular basis, you know, I spend probably hundreds of hours a year in the courtroom defending firefighters or the organizations that they represent against some of these things that went wrong. So what we want to talk about today is some of those other things that aren't so common in most people's minds, some things that they may not think about, and some things that, you know, we think are important and people realize, and that's where we came up with the title, It's Not the Fire That'll Burn You. That's not really where our problems and our issues is. It's all these other things that go around in the background that can lead to problems as we go through this service. You know, I spend hundreds of hours at this place. This is my local fire station where I volunteer. And I spend hours down there at meetings, at trainings, getting equipment ready, doing equipment checks, all of those type of things that, you know, firefighters and EMTs do on a regular basis. And every time when I come back from that place, then I walk in the door, you know, my wife always asks me, how was the whatever it is that I went to? How was the call? How was the training? How was the drill, the fundraiser, the meeting, or the officers meeting? And, you know, at first I thought that's really nice. My wife cares about what I did today, and, you know, I'm coming home to all these things. And then suddenly I realized that she really didn't care about how the call was, how the training was, or the drill was. She was just trying to figure out what my mood was going to be like for the next several hours after I got home. And when we talk to fire and, you know, folks in fire and EMS services, you know, we say, how many times have you gone home like this? You're just totally mad and aggravated at everything or anybody that could possibly come your way because of something that occurred down there at the firehouse. Or how many times do we go home like this? You know, where we just feel like we've been beat up. We feel like things have gone wrong. And when you talk to folks, they usually smile and laugh at this point and go, yeah, I've gone home like that a lot of times after a meeting, after a training, after a drill or a call or any of those type of events. So we start to look at the mood and say, what caused that? And we realize that it's hardly ever about the call itself. You know, we're good at those things. We're good at putting fires out. We're good at doing extrications. We're good at, you know, emergency medical responses. We've trained for hours and hours and hours on those things. And even when it doesn't go exactly as planned, we still know that we did the best that we could. I always say you give, even a truckie enough water and eventually the fire will go out. We've got the tools, we've got the equipment, we've got all the skills. So, we're ready to handle those things and we're ready to deal with those type of situations. But what we aren't always ready and what we don't know how to handle is a situation like this, where something does go wrong, where all of a sudden we or our organizations end up in the headlines. And then we start to ask ourselves, what did I really sign up for? What happened and how did this occur? And when those things do occur, who do we want to blame when something goes wrong? And we usually want to blame everybody but ourselves. We'll no matter what the circumstances is, we hear about a vehicle intersection collision and, a fire truck ran into a car in the middle of an intersection, or an ambulance runs into a car in the middle of the intersection. And if you show that to a bunch of firefighters and EMTs, they'll say it's the other person's fault. Didn't they know that we had someplace to go? Don't they know what they're supposed to do when we have lights and sirens on? Why didn't they pull over and yield to us and give us the right of way? So when we look at those situations, again, it's very easy for us to try to blame somebody else, to try to redirect where some of that is. But when we totally look at these things and we start to digest them and we start to see, what happened and what went wrong, most of the time we realize that a lot of that blame's on ourselves. What did we do to contribute to this situation? What could we have done differently to have prevented this type of situation? So we need to look at solutions. If we know what some of these things are and you look at historically at what goes wrong. So I'm the risk manager for an insurance company that insures fire departments and EMS services across the country. And every Monday morning on my desk is what we call a claims report. And as I look down through those claims report, there's very few times where I ever, look at my staff or say, hey, we've never seen this one before, or geez, this one's unusual. It's the same things that we see over and over and over again. All you do is change the name of the town or the color of the fire truck or the turnout gear that folks are wearing. And we realize that these same problems and issues are affecting everybody across the country. So if we're going to prevent it, we need to look at what happened, what's going wrong, and try to start to analyze these things. And what we soon find out, especially when we start talking to firefighters, fire officers, is that they don't always know, what they think may be the problems. And I think back to the first EMT class that I took, and I remember the instructor standing in the front of the room saying, do no harm. And I was nervous. I was a little bit scared, and I looked at all the things that I could do wrong that could harm my patient. Maybe I would misdiagnose something. Maybe I'd give them the wrong medication. Maybe I wouldn't realize that we should be doing something that we weren't currently doing. So I thought about all those things, and I was geez, this is a pretty big step and a lot of responsibility that I'm taking as we, transition into this role. But what I never thought about is what the things and what the numbers show. And we do spend a lot of time looking at data, trying to look at the numbers, trying to figure out exactly what went wrong and how it went wrong. And we realize that it's not the common things that we think that would lead to some of these issues. There's a whole bunch of other stuff going on. So what we're going to spend the time on today is talking about some of these liability issues. What they look like, what are the typical type claims that we see, and then what we can do as organizations to try to prevent some of these things from happening in our municipalities. So the top liability issue, and it has been year after year after year, is events involving our apparatus. How are we getting folks to the scene? What are we doing? When we look at the line of duty deaths, a lot of those have to do with these driving incidents as well. About 25% of the firefighter line of duty deaths per year are related to vehicle accidents. So either responding to, returning from a call. The volunteer organizations, we see a lot of that in their own private vehicles. So what do we do as an organization to prevent that and help to make that safer? So the top liability issue that, again, we've seen year in and year out is our failure to drive responsible. And when we look at that, we could spend, 2 or 3 hours talking about just this subject, but we want to look at some of the main things that really stand out to us. One of the biggest issues that we see is a failure to stop, negative right-of-way intersections. So we're talking about the traffic lights and the stop signs. Most state laws allow us to proceed through those intersections, whether the light is green or red. Most of our state laws allow us to proceed past that stop sign, but they all contain what I call the but clause. And it says that we can do those things, but only after we've assured the safety of the citizens. And that's worded a bunch of different ways in different state laws. But, we fail to realize that while the law gives us that ability to proceed through those negative right-of-way intersections, there really becomes a lot of responsibility that goes with that. So, it's important that we spend time, and you look at all the number of training hours that we spend on a whole variety of tasks. We look at the number of hours that we really spend on driver training. It's pretty small compared to a lot of the other things that we do. I look at a lot of the training that I've been through and stuff that I'll probably never see in my career, and probably never have to deal with in my jurisdiction. But yes, it's exciting stuff. So we spend some time, training on those issues. Whereas we really don't spend all that much time. We'll do some initial driver training. We'll get the people prepared and ready to drive the vehicles, but then we don't do the follow-up and the training with these things like we should on a regular basis. Another thing that we got to teach folks is to slow down. We put big engines in these things to, most of us will say, well, we put that in there so we can climb that one big hill in our district or something else. But most of the time, and now by NFPA standards, a lot of the vehicles are governed down in speed, but we really do drive too quickly. And when we have people understand the difference between this vehicle and the vehicle that they're driving on a regular basis and stopping distances and all of those type of things, it's important that they understand that they've got to drive within the control of the vehicle. We fail as a collective service to make sure that everybody is seated and belted. When we start looking at the line of duty death and injury reports, when we have a vehicle that goes off the road or rolls over, so many times the folks aren't seated and belted. Something that is as simple and basic as that, we find every excuse in the world to have folks not properly restrained in the vehicles. I tell folks all the time, we hear a common thing like, well, we can't be seated and belted because I've got to do patient care, and I can't do patient care in the back of the ambulance because that would restrain me too much. And when we looked at all these claims and all these incidents that we see, if the true number of people even had a patient on board, I would start to buy into that theory. But a lot of times it's just, the firefighters or the EMTs that are alone in the vehicles, and we're not doing any patient care at all. So we use that as an excuse sometime when we really shouldn't. We see a ton of claims where we back into things, whether it be our own station, whether it be something on the scene of a call, because we're not using a spotter. And when we do use a spotter, they're not doing the job correctly. Have we taken the time to train those folks on what that job and position really looks like? So it's important that we make driving a priority in our organizations. And again, that's a whole 2 or 3 hour course all on its own. And we could take it a whole bunch more time than that on the subject. But folks need to understand that we need to spend more time, talking about driving of our apparatus and our vehicles. Another big claim that we see a lot of is our failure to protect our funds. And we see this across the board, whether it be a government agency, a municipal agency, some of our volunteer organizations that we insure. We see a ton of theft of funds or misappropriation of funds. It's important that we do annual external audits so that somebody's, else is putting a set of eyes on these books. We're making sure we understand where the money's flowing, both internally and externally. And then we have an audit committee within the organization. Seen some organizations that have gone completely to the external audits, and then that auditor doesn't always understand. That case recently, where they did external audits, the person that was stealing from the organization had actually bought a bunch of computers, laptop computers. The external auditor, saw that and thought that that was fairly normal. The internal auditors, however, in their own audit committee said, we haven't had any new computers around here in a long time. And what they found was the individual had purchased these computers, turned in the invoice for it, and then was selling the computers on eBay after the fact. So both internal and external audits become very important for us. It's important that we segregate duties, and too many times we see the same person responsible from writing the check, getting the bank statement back, to doing the financial reports, and no one's really got a true picture of what's going on in the organization. 2 signatures on checks. And a lot of people think, with the digital age that we're in today, maybe this isn't necessary. Are the banks even looking at the signatures on the checks? It's a very good check and balance because, again, somebody else has now got a set of eyes on there. And we see it, we'll see organizations that'll pre-sign the checks and then turn them over to the treasurer, who then signs the check afterwards. So important that we look at the whole thing and that we have some kind of term limits, especially in the volunteer organizations. We see too many times where somebody's been the treasurer for the last 20 years, and that's what they rely on, is they rely on some unmonitored access to those funds over long periods of time. And it usually starts out very small. Usually we find out that these cases, nobody set out to steal from the organization. A lot of times they'll borrow some money. They get in a personal bind or pinch. They'll borrow some money from the organization because they see big dollar amounts sitting there. And then all of a sudden they didn't get the opportunity to pay it back and something else creeps up. And then they take a little more and they take a little more. And suddenly they realize, I've been siphoning some money out of here and nobody's really caught on. So when we go back and do the forensic audits, we find that, most of the time it started out kind of casually and long periods of time between it happened. And then they just get more and more comfortable in stealing or diverting those funds. And it becomes a huge problem for us. So again, we start with the vehicles, we go to theft of funds is another one that we see an unfortunate large amount at. Probably one of the largest growing concerns that we see is in the world of sexual harassment, whether it be sexual harassment, workplace violence. These can all be very straining for fire and EMS organizations. So what are some things that we can do in those areas? Have solid policies. Make sure that the policies are in place and they're being followed. They're not just written. And a lot of times we'll see where policies have been written down and they're put in the book, but nobody's really enforcing them or monitoring them. We need to make sure that we're providing our members and employees trainings. Most state laws now require us to do that. Here in New York, about a year and a half ago, we've had some new requirements where the sexual training, harassment training that we've been doing for years is no longer enough to meet the needs. So we used to talk about the Civil Rights Acts and we wouldn't discriminate based on age, sex, religion, any of those factors. And now we're talking a lot more diversity in these things. We're talking about sexual orientation and sexual gender. And a lot of the states have started to come forward, following what I call the Me Too movement, and demanding that we're doing a better job with these trainings and making sure that everybody understands. We need to make sure within our organizations that we have a solid complaint process. So if somebody feels like that they're being discriminated against or they're being harassed in some kind of format, where do they go? How do they make that complaint? Who is it that they talk to? And we should have a couple different channels for that. We've seen so many organizations where if they didn't like what was going on, they're supposed to go talk to the chief. Well, maybe it's the chief that's doing the harassing. Now what's their next best option? I also recommend organizations that they have both a male and a female that they can talk to and file a complaint with. So if I'm not comfortable talking to either one, I can talk to somebody else within the organization. When we get these claims in too many times, we see that they're not investigated immediately. They'll get the complaint in and they're like, well, we're not really sure what to do with this or how to handle this, or this is going to be uncomfortable for a lot of folks. So what do we do as an organization to move this thing forward? It's important that our policy spells out what can and can't be done, first of all, so our employees and our members understand that. But then our policy should spell out, okay, if this is going on in the organization, what do we do about it? How do we handle one of these complaints when it comes in? We have what we call an employee practice hotline here. So if somebody's having some issues within the organization, they can call in, talk to an attorney, and the attorney will guide them through the process. What should you be doing at this point in time? The first thing we always tell folks when they call in is, do you have a policy? Yep, we have a policy. Okay. What does your policy say you're supposed to do as far as this process, as far as this investigation goes? Well, we're not sure. We haven't looked at that policy yet. So the policy, a good policy will have that process in it. Make sure that you're getting that out when something goes wrong and then following that process through. Very important that we treat everybody equitably in these situations. And if we don't have that checklist, if we don't have that policy in place, that can become a problem for us. And then it's important to understand that we cannot tolerate this behavior, especially when we're talking about fire and EMS services. We talked about that downtime earlier. We got folks that spend a lot of time in close quarters. They have a lot of downtime in between calls and situations, and these things can occur and they'll build up. It's important that we as an organization kind of set the tone that we're not going to accept this type of behavior. We're not going to allow this to occur within our organization, and make sure that everybody's on the same page and know what their role is in this process that are moving forward. So up at this point, we've talked about what I see as three big issues and regular claims that we're seeing on a normal basis. But I want to spend the rest of the time talking about some things that we see starting to emerge and some things that I think are going to be bigger concerns for us as we move forward if we don't start to get a handle on some of these situations pretty early. First one that we're going to talk about is our failure to understand what I call instant technology. This is everything from the internet to social media to the ability of our cell phones nowadays. If you look at 20 years ago, we didn't have the ability to sit in one place and send messages to people, across a state, across a nation, or anywhere else. And a lot of the things that we're starting to see is occurring because of some of the technology advances that are there. Our failure to accept diversity. I mean, take a look at the nation at this point. COVID kind of hit us all hard in March, and we were just starting to deal with that and move some things forward. And then we saw a lot of civil unrest because of diversity and some issues that we've got within the country and how we handle that. That doesn't stay outside of the organization by itself. We're starting to see more and more of that impact our fire and EMS agencies. So what can we do about that? Failure to understand our struggles, and we need to understand what our people are dealing with on a regular basis and what we can do as an organization to help prevent that. When we start looking at the number of suicides, about 3 times the number of line of duty deaths that we're seeing in the fire service at this point in time. EMS services are just the same. So we need to understand, what those struggles are and what we can do as an organization to try to prevent them. Our failure to follow policies and procedures. So most of us have these policies and procedures in place, but do we follow them on a regular basis? Do people understand what those are and what they look like? And do we, as simple as, have all our trainings following those policies and procedures? And a lot of our organizations we find really don't. And then the biggest thing that I see at this point in time, and usually when I go in and look at an organization, some places you walk into and they have beautiful buildings, $1 million buildings and gorgeous equipment and all the latest technologies and all those type of things. And you would think that some of those would be the best organizations that are out there. You would think that those are most likely to not have a lot of claims when it comes to the insurance end of things. But what we see is it really doesn't matter how much money it's there. Most of the time it comes back to the leadership of the organization. Are the leaders doing everything appropriately? So, I've walked into some firehouses that I thought, boy, this place is just a disaster waiting to happen. And then go back and look at their records, and their claims histories are pretty good. And then some of those other places where we walk in and, boy, this is the Taj Mahal and this place is beautiful. These guys got to be doing everything correctly. And then we find out that maybe they aren't doing such a good job. And so many times that goes back to the leadership, and we'll spend a couple minutes talking about that. So the first area, we want to touch on here is that failure to understand technology and social media use. And we need to understand as organizations that social media and some of this instant technology is one of the fastest growing challenges that we have. How do we control this? How do we use it to our advantage? And what are some of the concerns and things that can come out of those situations? One issue that we've seen a lot of is the court stance is still evolving on what our folks can and can't do on social media, especially when it comes to their own private accounts. So we've seen a number of challenges on this where organizations, didn't like something that one of their employees or members was posting on social media, and they've let the person go, or they've reprimanded the person. The person then files, some charges against the organization. And the pendulum has kind of swung back and forth on this. What are our, freedom of speech rights? What does that look like? What's that mean for our organization? And like I said, every time I think I've got it about figured out where the courts are going to land on these things, the pendulum starts to shift a little bit in the opposite direction. So this is one that we really need to pay attention to and make sure that we understand, what can and can't folks do on their own social media accounts, especially when it comes to those freedom of speech type issues. Another big area that we've seen in a very quickly growing area is their off-duty conduct. So now they're not at the firehouse or the ambulance station. They're out there on their, their own personal time doing their own things. But is some way they relating what they're saying, or is there reasonable, is there a reason for a person to believe that this person is a spokesman of the organization in which they belong to? We've seen a ton of those cases. This was one that took place in Ohio. A firefighter posted up on their social media account, "One dog is more important than 1 million African lives," and then went on to say that, if he got called to a structure fire, he's going to go in there and save an animal before he'd save an African American. I mean, obviously something that just shouldn't be tolerated and can't be tolerated. But this gentleman didn't do it on behalf of the fire service. He did it on his own personal time. And that was kind of his argument was, well, these are my personal opinions. Well, they were your opinions until you brought in the fact that if I respond to a call, you've got pictures on your Facebook account of you in uniform and those type of things. And that's where we've seen, some of the rulings come down saying, people's time, while it may be their own time, if it can reasonably be inferred that they're speaking on behalf of the organization, that can become a problem for us. There was another one that this person was actually on vacation. They were down in the Caribbean somewhere, and they posted on their social media account. This was after the Pittsburgh took the field, or they didn't take the field during the national anthem for a game. And this guy was a fire chief and decided to start talking about that on his own personal Facebook page. He was actually let go by the town, and the town's rights were, upheld, saying people had the reasonable right to assume or infer that he was speaking on behalf of the organization, even though he was doing it on his own personal time and his own personal space. So what do I do to keep my organization out of the headlines, to keep my organization out of some of these legal problems? First thing we need to do is understand that the times and the technologies have changed. You see the sign over here, "In case of fire, exit the building before tweeting about it." And you can kind of laugh at that at first, but we actually had an employee who's one of their children had a vehicle fire. So somebody calls the fellow employee here and says, "Geez, are they okay? I saw they had a vehicle fire," and the parent wasn't even aware that that was going on at that time. So they picked up the phone and they called their child and they said, "What's going on?" They said, "Well, the car started driving funny, and then I pulled over and flames came out from under the engine compartment and started to burn." And they're like, "Well, is the fire out yet?" And they're, "Well, no, not yet. It's still burning." "Well, is the fire department there?" "I haven't seen them." "Did you call the fire department?" "No, I haven't." So that person actually put it on their social media account, take a picture of their car burning and what a bad day they're having, and they never even called the fire department. So, we need to understand some of the mentality and the mindset that's out there and what that looks like. We need to educate our members and our employees on the public image and dangers. So what is available? What's it look like out there? And what can be, what can be the challenges for our organization when that exists? We need to make sure that we've got a good solid policy in the organization, and we need to update that regularly. Too many times I've seen organizations that'll have what they call like a Facebook policy, and it's not just Facebook now. There's Snapchat and TikTok and all these other different things that are out there. So we need to make sure that we're staying ahead of the latest technology and trends that are there. We need to monitor and coach social media activities. And I'm not saying stalk all your employees or your members' pages, but we ought to have some kind of idea what they're talking about out there on their own personal sites, and make sure that they understand, again, what we do approve of and what we don't approve of as an organization. A lot of organizations, ask questions about helmet cams and how that can be a problem for them, or whether they should be allowing helmet cams in the business. And helmet cams, they've got some use. I mean, we can get a ton of training footage off those. There's really good things, and that's usually most people's excuses. But, different organizations have started to, and here's a statement from, the IAFF president at the time, we're going into people's homes, we're videotaping their personal belongings. All of these things puts the public at risk. We don't want to compromise that trust. So it's important that our folks understand, if we're going to use helmet cams and we're going to use and record any of that type of information or take pictures, that we as an organization have the responsibility to make sure that all of that's controlled. So who has access to it? How's it being released? What are we doing? That we're documenting all of it, that it's stored, And then, people need to understand that this can be used as evidence in cases moving forward. So we as an organization, if it was taken on organization time or with any of our equipment, we got to make sure that that stuff is stored and it's used correctly. And then we need to make sure that it's properly released. So if we are going to use it for training purposes, if we are going to use it for some PR purposes, we should have a set process that people go through to get that information out and what it looks like. We got to make sure that we have, some strong policies, and our policy needs to firmly address the issue. This is what our issue and our stance is on social media. This is what you as an employee member should or should not be doing with that. You got to make sure that people understand that our department's not going to tolerate the misuse of any of these things. When you put your policy together, avoid any jargon that can be in there. I've seen a lot of policies that have wording in it like this, and I kind of scratch my head going, I'm not sure what they're really talking about. Well, neither do your employees or members at that point in time. So, make sure that you spell it right out. Do not mention information about our department or members and officers that's not publicly available. Do not say anything that compromises the integrity of the department or our members or employees. Violators will be punished up to possible termination. Even I can read that one and understand what they're trying to say and what that means. So with our social media, we want to make sure that we're being consistent. We want to make sure that we're following our policy. Make sure your folks are using some common sense as they go through there. And just tell your folks, hey, if you've ever got to ask yourself, is this okay to post? Then don't post it, because it's probably not. And so many times people go, yeah, I kind of wondered whether I should post that or not. If you've got to think about it, you probably shouldn't be posting it to your site. And those are the conversations that we need to have with our employees and our members. Another huge area of concern that we're seeing at this point in time, like I mentioned earlier, is diversity. And I'll ask people, what do you see in this picture? And, we'll get people's answers back. Well, I see both men and women firefighters. I see both black and white firefighters. I see old and young firefighters. I see gay and straight firefighters. And that's a problem if people see that when they look at this picture. What we want people to do is look at this picture and say, I see a group of firefighters, and I see a group of people that'll have my back should something go wrong. And we're a long ways from that in this society. And there's some extremes starting to come out, obviously, in some of the protests and the political commentary that we're starting to see, and that trickles down into our organizations. And we need to understand what that looks like and what we've got to do as an organization to try to prevent that. I used to have this quote when as chief of the department. I used to have this hanging on my wall in the office. It says, if you're not willing to be part of the solution, there's a pretty good chance that you're part of the problem. And I firmly believe that, and that's the message that we need to get across to our employees and the folks that are working with us. I put that together back in 1976, and I thought at the time that really spelled things out. I think if I had to put it up today, it would be something more like this. If you're not willing to treat everyone equally and with respect, you are part of the problem. And that's what our folks need to understand, is that, we do have a diverse culture, we have a diverse employee base, and we have a diverse community. And we need to make sure that we're responding to that community equitably, regardless of which end of town it may be on, if you will, regardless of who's involved. We've got a lot of organizations now that are starting to respond to some of this civil unrest and the protests. And we better have talked about that ahead of time, and we should have some solid policies in place within our organization to make sure that we're going to do the right things moving forward. We've seen some organizations that have got jammed up recently by displaying flags. There was a sheriff's department up here in central New York. There was a Trump boat parade going on over Labor Day weekend, and the sheriff's deputies that were on the boat decided to put a Trump flag on the sheriff's department boat as they were patrolling the waters around the situation. Well, as you can imagine, that caused quite a stir, and some people have lost their jobs over that. We just had a fire department that had a flag displayed on their vehicle that offended some people in the community, and those people have lost their positions as well. So we need to understand that that's out there. We need to understand what that looks like and what we can do as an organization to prevent that from becoming a problem for us. Another area that I see as one of these top emerging concerns is, I call it suck it up, buttercup, but do we really understand our people and what they're going through? Too many times we look at firefighters and we look at EMTs, and they're supposed to be these tough people and not let things bother them. But when we look at the numbers, There was a study done on, suicide in the United States back in 2015. And that study revealed that, 13.5% of the people had thought about committing suicide. Another 3.9% has gone as far as to plan it. If I'm going to go through with this, how I'm going to do it. And 4.6% had actually attempted suicide sometime in their life. During that same time, they did a study of 1,027 firefighters, and they realized that 46.8% had thought about suicide. So when you compare that number to the number of the general population, that needs to be pretty concerning for us. Another 19.2% had actually planned on how they might do it, and 15.5% had actually attempted suicide sometime in their career. When we look at EMS folks, they're 6 times more likely, both EMS and women in the fire and EMS services, 6 times more likely to commit suicide than their counterparts in the general population. So, we need to stay, and what do we do as an organization? We need to understand that first responders are going to see, hear, smell, touch, and experience things probably that no human should ever have to hear, see, smell, or touch. It's normal that it'll affect you, and it's normal for other people in your department to be affected as well. So we need to start talking about that some more in our organizations. Hey, if you're not okay with what we just saw in that call, if you're not okay with what we just dealt with there, it's okay to talk about. We need to understand that, PTSD is an injury. And there's different things that as organizations that we need to understand, and there's organizations out there that we can turn to so that people understand, what those issues are, what we're struggling with as firefighters and EMTs, and what that looks like in your organization. The last area that I want to touch on today is our failure to step up and lead. And too many times we get people, especially in the volunteer service, where they may be elected into a position and they really haven't had any kind of leadership training. In our career and our combination departments, we see a little better process in most of these and how we select our leaders. But then still, we need to look at how much time did we actually spend training these people on how to do that job? Do they understand what that job looks like and what it means going, forward? When we look at, different things that are going on, report cites leadership failures in this fire that killed, one of the captains. When we look at the line of duty death reports and we look at the reports and investigations that come out after these things, we realize so many times that leadership is to blame, and leadership should have done some things differently that they didn't do. So we need to take a look at all those OSHA reports and the things that they say. In this report that cited that the chief failed to do a 360-degree walk around. There was no universal accountability set up on the scene. The incident commander could not easily be located. Chief performed engineering duties instead of the command duties that they should have been performing. And when I look at any of these type of reports, or I look at line of duty death reports, I tell folks, take a look at those findings and then ask yourselves, could these same things happen in my organization tonight? And too many times they could. And there's things that we should have been doing to put in place to prevent them that we didn't do. I think Paul Coombs really nailed it when he put this thing out. We've got to train people that once they roll into these leadership positions, they can't be everybody's buddy anymore. They've got to start being a leader. They've got to start to make some unpopular decisions. And they're just not ready to do that in all the cases. So when we look at that leadership and what our roles are as a responsibility, we got to make sure that we've got solid qualifications for the positions. Everybody understands what those are, and we're not just trying to fit somebody into that job, that we have some solid qualifications and we make sure that everybody follows them. We got to make sure that once they have those leadership positions, that we require continuous training. Too many organizations we see where you have to have certain qualifications to get in, but once you're there, we really don't spell out anything after the fact. Times are changing, that continuous education needs to train as well. Make sure that you've got a good solid mentorship program. If the chief of your organization can't tell you right now who the next chief should be, if it's going to be somebody within, then we've got a problem in the organization. We need to spend some time mentoring folks, making sure that everybody understands what's going to be involved and who those next people are in charge. We need to make sure that those people understand they're no longer a firefighter. If they want to drag hoses, if they want to throw ladders, they want to do all of those kind of things, that's not a leadership position. and they've got to be ready to take charge of those incidents. You got a white shirt for a reason, and that's so it doesn't get dirty. Make sure your folks understand what the functions of that leader are and what they should be doing. And in the volunteer service, if they're worried about getting reelected and they don't want to, take matters into their own hands because they're afraid that they're going to not get reelected next year, then it's time probably to get out of that situation, because it's just not good for either yourself or the organization in general. I saw this quote at a conference I was at, and it really kind of struck home with me. And I think it strikes home with both our leadership and the members and employees of our organizations. It said, every day you're given the opportunity to tarnish or polish the badge. Which are you going to do today? And I think that, that's the message that we need to instill within our folks. Again, it's not the fires that we're going to have trouble with. It's not the extrication. It's not the EMS calls that are going to give us grief. It's all these other things that are going on in the background. It's the diversity issues, the sexual harassment issues, the failure to lead issues that are going to be problems for us in our organizations as we move ahead. So we threw quite a lot at you guys in a very short period of time, and we understand that. If there's anything that I can help you with, if you'd like to, talk further, my email address is up there on the stream. My phone number is on the screen as well. Feel free to reach out. Be glad to talk about these subjects in a lot more detail if anybody's got any specific questions. And the main thing is just be safe out there. It is a dangerous world that we're living in, and there's things that we can and should be doing for our organizations to keep everybody out of the headlines and out of the, keep them alive and out of jail. So with that, did we have any questions come in during the program that we can help to answer?
Yeah, I got one question that came in. It says, how can we instill greater personal accountability in our departments?
And I think that's tough. And I think one of our failures, and it's interesting when you start looking at some of the studies that are out there and what they do, organizations that hold their people accountable, and nobody wants to hold their people accountable because they figure like they'll be unpopular or they'll figure that people get mad. We actually find that other employees actually, lose interest in a job, they lose interest in a position if everyone's not being held accountable, and if they think somebody's getting away with something or that management's letting something slide. So I think a lot of the times it's our fear to, try to enforce the rules. It's our fear to make people do certain things that we find out in the long run. If we set clear expectations and goals, and so many times, especially in the fire service, we're not doing annual evaluations. We should be doing an annual evaluation of all of our folks, saying this is what you're doing well, this is what you could use for improvement, and then we'll move forward from there. So to hold people accountable, we've got to make sure that the system is there. We've got to make sure that we have the solid policies in place, and then we got to make sure that the leadership is doing their job just to step up and hold them accountable in those positions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dave.
Anything else in there?
Perfect. Thanks, Dave. Terrific presentation.
Thank you.
Our next presenters will be Phil Heck and Isaac Talbot with Central Valley Water Reclamation Facility. Phil is the general manager for Central Valley, which provides wastewater services to nearly 600,000 residents in Salt Lake County. Prior to joining Central Valley in 2014, he spent 27 years as an engineering consultant working on a myriad of projects. Phil has served as the president of the Water Environment Association of Utah, and he holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Civil Engineering from the University of Kansas, a Master of Science degree in Sanitary Environmental Engineering from the University of California at Berkeley, and a PhD in Environmental Science and Engineering from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His co-presenter, Isaac Talbot, is the Environmental Health and Safety Manager for Central Valley, and he is a graduate from Utah State University. Prior to working at Central Valley, he also worked as a compliance officer and consultant for Utah Occupational Safety and Health, or UOSH. Central Valley is in the process of really a metamorphosis. It's to call it a plant upgrade is probably putting it mildly. It's a significant upgrade and expansion to meet new nutrient standards, as well as a host of other process upgrades and facility upgrades. There are multiple contractors involved, all while they have to maintain their day-to-day operations of treating their wastewater flows. So with that, we'll turn it over to Phil and Isaac.
Thank you, Brian. Which screen are you seeing?
We're seeing the prompter view, so you want to go ahead and swap those if you can.
Okay, let's see. Is this...
Up on display settings, you'll have the option to.
There.
Perfect.
There. Now is it? You're seeing the screen properly now?
Indeed, we are.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone, for attending. I'm Phil Heck, and General Manager of Central Valley. I'll start off the presentation here with some background slides on Central Valley and kind of get into our safety program regarding construction. And then I'll turn it over to Isaac, and he can talk about some of the specifics. Let's see. Central Valley, some background on Central Valley. We are a interlocal agreement agency. We're actually owned by 7 other entities, and we do the wastewater treatment for these entities, and the entities collect the wastewater and deliver it into our interceptor sewer system, and then we transport it down here to the treatment facility. Our service area is shown on this screen, and the entities we serve are Granger Hunter, Kearns Improvement, Taylorsville Benyon, Murray City, South Salt Lake City, Mount Olympus, and Cottonwood Improvement District. So a big swath of the central part of the Salt Lake Valley, just south of about I-80, 21st South, all the way down to about 72nd South on the west side, and maybe about 98 South on the east side. So the area is about 115 square miles and close to 600,000 people. Our current flow is around 55 million gallons a day. So that translates to about 20 billion gallons of sewage treated annually. We discharge to Mill Creek, which then flows to the Jordan River and the Great Salt Lake. And we're under some regulatory pressure. There's been some new regulations passed in actually 2014 regarding removal of phosphorus, which is a nutrient from the wastewater. And so our current process does not do that. And so since that regulation came into being, we've been in a planning and design mode to upgrade the treatment process to remove phosphorus. And so part of the program we're undertaking now regarding construction is to remove phosphorus. Part of it is to provide some additional capacity with that construction to meet the needs of the growth of population within the service area for the next 30 years. And then the other factor we have here going at Central Valley is the plant's about 35 years old. And while the buildings and some of the main infrastructure have a design life well beyond 35 years, most of the process equipment, pumps and different types of treatment equipment they only have a design life of about 25 years. So in many cases, we're beyond the design life and we're seeing equipment failure. And so we're in this program of upgrading and replacing all of our process equipment. And so that's been going on a couple years now, and it will continue on for about another 10 years. So this slide is a plant overview map, and the main point here is that we have a lot going on. All of these colored structures are programmed over the next 5 years on construction. So basically, most of the major facilities at the plant will be touched from construction. Since January of this year to the present, we've bid out about $220 million worth of construction projects. Over the next 6 months, we have about another 90 million to bid out. And so, you know, the whole program will be over 300 million when we're through with this. And it'll occur over about a 5-year period. So getting into the safety aspects of this construction program, we started really planning for the process changes and the construction in 2015. We started the design in 2017, and so it's taken about 2.5 years to get through the design. But in 2017, one of the things we did was we went out for contractor pre-qualification, and this is something we feel very strongly about. We want to get good contractors, not only because we want quality construction product and we want contractors that are used to building wastewater treatment facilities and know what they're doing in that realm. But as you can see highlighted on my screen here, one of the sections of our pre-qualification program is health and safety. And so we have a long form that we ask the contractors to fill out, and it includes a lot of questions and backup materials, such as this page where we're asking about their insurance program and what it covers and what their limits are, and asking them to supply that information. We have a sheet like this. We're asking about their EMR rates and injuries and illness, and asking them to submit information on that and whether they have OSHA citations and violations. And then we ask a whole series of questions about their health and safety program. And these are some of the types of written documents we want to see in their health and safety program, and make sure that it's a complete program. And with our current projects, as I mentioned, we went out for pre-qualification in 2017, and we selected 3 contractors to work on this program with us. And we had a couple other contractors submit, and they did not make the cut. And the main reason was the health and safety. We eliminated them because they did not have adequate health and safety programs. So this is just our scoring sheet after we get the submittal for each section of our pre-qualification program. We score them, and so it rolls up into a number, and then we have a cutoff. So that's kind of the start of our health and safety program. It begins with the selection of contractors that can do the work and can do it safely. So I'll turn it over to Isaac, and he'll continue on with some additional slides.
Thank you there, Phil. And so, Exactly. A lot of our process begins by pre-qualification of the contractors, making sure that they are who we want to have on our job site as we are working. I threw this slide in here to show that we are in the throes of construction right now. As we started, on the image on the left is my plant, is the facility. When I started here about 4 years ago, and then the image on the right is our facility just a few days ago, as we are in the heart of the construction. But as we get going, we need to remember that we qualify these guys. Now we got our contract signed and our groups picked of who won the contracts, and then we start working with the contractors. And as we get it going along, we always ask that the engineering firm and the contractor submit a site safety plan. And part of these site safety plans, they go out and they come back, and a lot of times they're generic forms that come back from the National Safety Council or from other organizations that help companies put these plans together. When those plans do come back to us, we resubmit them back to the contractor so that they could be revised and updated with site-specific hazards. So I know there's been a couple of them. We had one that went out and it came back to us as a 90-page plan. We submitted it back to them and it came back as a 25-page plan, but it was very specific to the hazards associated with our job site. And some of those hazards are dealing with confined space entry, hot work permits, working in classified areas or around chemicals, and other things like scaffolding and trenching. So I took a couple of pages off of the site safety plan that was submitted to us for our site-specific plan. And as you can see, we have the information on the left-hand side of the screen, and then on the right-hand side, I jumped to the job hazard analysis. So this company decided to classify different jobs by what they were doing, and then to have different hazards associated with those work efforts that they were going to be doing. And then in the right-hand column of that, they have the mitigation, or what they were going to do to help alleviate or mitigate some of those hazards associated with working on our job site. And again, when they submit these site safety plans, we are very specific on what we are dealing. We want to make sure that their plans and their programs are the same as our, or at least as effective as our programs and programs in place. So after we get our safety plan from the contractor, then we always have what we call a project kickoff meeting. And as part of this project kickoff meeting, we discuss lots of different areas. We go do we talk about different hazards. They talk about contract and how the payment works, and a lot of different other things. But as far as safety goes, we discuss the hazards, we discuss timelines and the nature of the industry. And we talk about some of the other contractors, including the subcontractors that may be involved. We always do a walkthrough as well with the site and make sure that they are aware of what we need and how we are going to go about delivering those things. We always get a copy of their insurance forms as well to make sure that their insurance policies are current and active. And with that, we get the general insurance policy, and as well as make sure that their workers' compensation policy is up to date and current as well. Part of these meetings and these kickoff meetings is we also want to make sure that they're aware of any specialty things that we need to go as part of our process. As part of the renovation portion of this process means that we got to keep our facility going as it is. We cannot shut our facility down to have them build a new facility. So we need to make sure that we can, and a lot of these projects, we had to make sure that that was understood and clear in the contracts as well. So now that we got the job site, they've been given the go-ahead to start working and are here on our plant site, then we have them go through what we call our contractor safety orientation. And when we started doing this contractor safety orientation, it was at the will of the contractors. They would come in one morning and say, I've got 4 guys that need to be trained. And then another contractor would come in at noon and say, I have 4 guys that need to be trained. And then at 3 p.m., another contractor would come in and say, I have 2 more guys. So I was finding that we were spending a lot of time doing these contractor safety orientations. So we have decided that we were going to make them scheduled every Monday and Wednesday at 7 a.m. in our admin building. And this is outside of our fence line or our secured property area. And we did this on purpose so that way all the contractors could find the building and they can make it to it and not have to worry about them getting lost in our facility or getting around, and taking care of them that way. So we are requiring that all of the employees come into our facility and go through our contractor safety orientation. And as they do that, so that we know who they are and who they're going to be with and where they're going to be working in our facility. So as part of our contractor safety orientation, these are some of the topics that we cover in our facility or at our contractor safety orientation. So of course, we always want to make sure that we're covering our emergency action, and what to do, how to communicate, where to go, what to do in the event of emergency. We talk about access. We make sure that they are aware that we have cameras around in our facility. We talk about what we expect for them in and out of our buildings, and how we have provided different facilities for them to use. And then we also talk about hazards that are involved in our industry. So we talk about our hazard communication, some pathogens that are present in the wastewater, and can't stress enough that some of these guys are coming into our facility have never worked in a wastewater treatment facility, so we want to make sure that they are aware of those hazards. And then of course we always work with any specific hazards that are dealing with that project. So as we go about, we always like to make sure that I show a map of the facility, and this is one of the maps that we worked with our engineering firm that is part of our plan, and as we were doing this. So as we were planning our process, we wanted to make sure that people kind of get a feel for how big our facility is and where the different projects will be as they are working in our facility. So we always start down in our admin building, which is over here outside of our fence line. We always talk about entrance and where we expect the contractors to park, and then different projects that we've got going on. So right now we currently have projects in our headworks area over here for our BNR basins. We've got a 3W project over in the top left, and then we are also replacing some of our digester lids here in the middle of our facility. So we always want to make sure they kind of get an idea of how we are in our facility, where different things are at as well. So now that we are showing the map, we also want to make sure that we have good communication on site. So we tell them, all of our contractors, how we communicate in our facility and how we expect them to be able to communicate with us. And we can't stress the importance, especially as we are an ongoing facility. Sometimes an airline or something like that gets struck by while they're excavating, and we need to be able to be aware of those things, or of injuries or illnesses or anything that happens pretty quickly, so that way we can get it under control and make sure that our facility is maintained and going. So we always want to make sure that we have good communication on our job site. Another thing that we started doing this year is we started badging all of our contractors, all of the employees. So after they get done with their contractor safety orientation, we give each one of them a badge. And this is done so that we can help limit some of the access on weekends and off times, and as well that we can know who is here and in our facility and working in and around. So as you can see, we've also badged, well, you can't see it, but we've also badged our employees. Our badges have a white background, and the contractor's background is always yellow, so it's easy to see who is a contractor and who is an employee. Also, we've also made sure that all the contractors have current photos and their name and the contractor that they are working with, so that we can have an idea of who they are and where they will be working. Now, one of the things we thought of before we started doing this is, in the construction industry, there's a lot of turnover and a lot of back and forth that way. So we've always wanted to make sure that we can deactivate the badges that are not currently working as employees or not working on our projects. So we request from each of the generals to contractors to provide a monthly list of their badges, active badges, so that we can go through and deactivate those that are not working on our job site. And we also have worked with the contractor so that they can have, if they need to have access outside of the time of that we have given them, that they can have that time, and we can work with those as well. So we've also set up a guard shack, a security guard on the south end of our facility. And we have done this to help facilitate the contractors being able to come into our facility and being able to get around, and also to help with deliveries and other things that we may need to have help with as they're coming and going onto our facility. So we have contracted with the security firm, and they have come in. We've made sure that they attended our contractor safety orientation, so they are aware of the hazards and aware of what's going on in our facility as well. We've also given them very specific instructions on what to do and how to help people access our facility. So one of the things we've very specifically is if they don't have their badge on them that day, they are not getting access into our facility. And so even if they're carpooling, we want to make sure that everybody in the car has a badge to get access to our facility. We also have designated some spots for delivery so that if the contractor is bringing deliveries in, that they inform the guard beforehand, and he can help facilitate them a little bit quicker getting in and out of and around our facility. The guards have also been given instructions on how to communicate around our plant site and if they need to. So as the guard is working in our facility, this is kind of the things that he sees. So we've given them a whiteboard in there to help give instructions as the guards. There's 2 or 3 guards that work for us or work with us in our booth. And then they also see this computer screen. So we have given them access to some of our computer functions in our facility, and made sure that it is a secure username and password unique to them. But as you can see on this screen, so as contractors come in, this area up on the top of that right-hand screen shows the picture of the contractor, and then it will say if that badge is current or they are granted access or denied access into our facility. So we've also tried to make this as nice for the guards as possible, and that we've given them blinds, and they've asked for red lights as well. So in those early morning hours that they can have their night vision maintained in those facilities. This building is secured and locked, and we make sure that it is under control that way. But it's also nice for the guards to be able to see some of the security cameras that we have around our facility and be able to help watch that as they're working in and around our facility. One of the issues that we had going into this is we have a very limited amount of parking for our employees, let alone when we have a lot of contractors coming onto our facility. So we have designated a couple of areas for the contractors to be parking. Now we also had to make sure that we had safe access from the parking areas to their working stations. And as we were going about this, we decided we needed another parking area, so we created a second parking area for the contractors as well, or by their trailers. Now, and here's just some of the parking areas that we have improved. Instead of having it just gravel, we've improved it so that it's road based. And then we also have put up barricades and so that they cannot drive their vehicles around on our facility. As well from that, as we are asking the contractors to park down in that south end of our facility, we've also needed to make sure that they had a safe passage between that to get to our facility. So we have also installed bridges and walkways and the railing, as you can see there, so that we can make sure that our contractors are safe and be able to get to their respective job sites. We are working with 3 general contractors currently, and they have several subcontractors that go around and work it as well. Another thing that we wanted to make sure that we did is we wanted to provide a good bathroom facility for our contractors. Working in the wastewater industry, we have known pathogens that come into our facility from the sewage water. And so we also needed to provide a method for the contractors to have a facility to stay clean and wash their hands. So we've decided that we set up this bathroom or this restroom trailer that has a men's and a women's restroom, and then the middle door is a first aid room where we've set up a water fountain and an ice machine and a first aid kit for our contractors. But so we are expecting our contractors to use this facility and not go into the facilities in our buildings. As part of as well, as we've done this as well, we just wanted to make sure that they had good access to the facilities. There's a kind of a screenshot of our. Some of our contractors have said that cell phones don't work in that building for their employees when they go in there, but I think they still do. But we'll keep that secret between us so that way they're not in there spending all day in the restroom. But as we have also set up contractor trailers and set up a portion of our facility to designate for the contractors to bring in trailers and set up their areas. We have brought in a double wide trailer for our engineering firm so that way we can hold meetings in that building, or that was the design, so that way we're not tying up our meeting rooms and that with our construction meetings. But now with COVID, we have gone more to a virtual type of meeting, and we are using Microsoft Teams for most of our meetings now, which has been working great. But we've also needed a space for the specialty contractors as well. As we were working these putting these trailers together. So there are a couple of specialty contractors like electricians and HVAC contractors that are working with all three of our general contractors in their bids to make sure that they're going about this. So now we've got the contractors here, they're set up, they're working. We've talked to all of their employees as they come into our facility. We can get ready and start doing the work. And we, as you saw on that first slide I started, we are definitely in that construction mode. So now on a weekly basis, we hold weekly construction meetings. And we talk about several different portions of this meetings, so that way we can make sure that we are going and up to date and keeping in track with that. So they are conducted by the engineering firm that holds this and invites us and other participants to be involved. As I said, we are using due to the coronavirus, we have also elected to do most of these virtually instead of in person there, which has worked out okay. I just put up a screenshot of my calendar so you could kind of get a feel of the meetings that we have. Nearly all of those meetings are dealing with the construction process and the different projects that we have got going on. In each of these weekly meetings, we always cover safety topics and then admin items or general discussion. We always talk about our plant operation and then let the contractors kind of take care of submittals and information that they need from that. And another important part of that is that we always discuss the schedule for each of our meetings. So part of the safety items of this is, and we have had to have ongoing reminders about what we need to do for our safety and health as part of our process. So we've had to remind contractors about speed limits, about housekeeping, about smoking, about working inside in our buildings and around in our tunnels. We've also had to review some incidents that we've had. We have not had any injuries, significant injuries so far, but we have made sure that we review those with our contractors and with the other contractors so that everybody is aware of what's going on. And of course, we've need to talk about near misses during this time as well. And again, like I said, if it happens with one of our contractors, we make sure that the other contractors are all involved or are aware of what's going on in our facility as well during their meetings. Part of the general discussion, we talk about upcoming shutdowns and anything else that we need to discuss. Part of this process is making sure that we can maintain our facility operating as well. So we need to discuss about planned operations. And we also discuss the timeline so that we could kind of get an idea of what's upcoming and what the contractors will be working on, and usually do those in a 3-week period, so that way we can see what's ahead on our schedule and make sure that we need to be able to do what we need to do with that. And we also make sure we need to coordinate between our plant staff and all of our construction contractors. Now with that, we have determined, we call them MOPOs. We call them maintenance of plant operation plans. So part of these MOPOs that we have designed is when we need to shut down certain areas or work on certain things and make sure that our plant is prepared to do that, and so it doesn't affect our process, but as well to make sure that the contractors are ready for their part of the process as well. So part of these planned shutdowns, we make these contractors submit these to us at least a week in advance, and they submit them to our engineering firm, and they review them. They submit them over to us, we review them, and then we let them put them out to the general public of at our facility on our message boards and other means of communication. So part of this is important is, like I said, we need to maintain our processes as it is, so that way we can make sure that our facility is functioning. So we need to know the areas that are affected, and so that we can, sometimes we need to get in and clean some of these areas as well, so that they are clean and ready for the contractors. Here's just another example of a MOPO or a maintenance plan that has been submitted to us. And so a lot of times they do come with these drawings and showing us where, and this one started this week, and they are taking up on more of our parking spaces, so we had to plan for that as well. So just things that we needed to be able to plan ahead for and be able to make sure that everybody is aware as we're going through our facility and maintaining that plant operation. So now as we go through our meetings and be able to make sure that everybody is aware and going and informed of what's going on. Now, part of the plant safety operation as well is going through and making sure that the contractors are following our safety protocols as we get going on these things. So I've just highlighted a few of these that we are looking at and ensuring that our contractors are doing as well. One of those being our lockout and tag out procedures. So we always need to make sure that we de-energize or be able to make sure that the tanks aren't going to be filled with sludge or with water, that they can do that. So we always make sure that the contractors are aware of what valves or what switches we need to throw so that they are protected as well. Now, when we do this, we always want to make sure that they are verifying that they have locked it out and that we have locked it out, so that way we are protecting all the parties involved with our lockout tagout. Another is our hot work permit. So we do have some hot welding, or we do have some classified areas or some areas that we need to be very, very careful with our hot work. So we make sure that they are following our procedures and our protocols and making and being safe with that. Another thing working in the wastewater industry is working with confined spaces. You name it, and we pretty much have it as a confined space. And a lot of times they're required confined spaces as they're working in our facilities. So again, as this goes back to our site safety plan, that we made sure that they knew that we had confined spaces, and in the areas that they would be working, where those hazards were and what they needed to do to protect their employees and working in those spaces. So we have a copy of one of our contractors' confined space permits there, and we made sure that they go through and follow those protocols and follow our protocols that are sometimes a little bit different than what the regular protocols for entering confined spaces, and with testing air and making sure rescue equipment is involved. Now with our rescue equipment, some of our areas are pretty specialized areas, so we have equipment that is designed, that we have made or have made for our areas. One of those, so in some of those areas, we do allow our contractors to use some of our confined space or rescue equipment, but for the most part, we have them bring in their own equipment. Then as we go through some of our confined space entries, if any of our employees are involved, we make sure it's our permit. If it's the contractor or subcontractors' employees, then they can use their permitting process in that. But then as we make sure that they have the means of egress and entrance and test the air. And then as well, when they're open holes, we make sure that they are covered and protected from, as our employees are working in and around that area as well. Another thing that we wanted to make sure that everybody was on the same page was with scaffolding safety. As we made sure that they do their personal inspections or their daily inspections with a competent person, and that sometimes these scaffolds are used by multiple contractors as well. So we want to make sure that they're all in good shape and working that way. So here's a couple other images of some of the scaffolding that is in and around our facility. But we just want to make sure that it is safe to use for the contractors. As well, we talk about trenching and shoring and making excavation safety is being followed with their trench boxes and some of their excavations that they are going. We just can't be too sure. You just got to make sure that they're following those protocols. As well, again, our employees are in and around working in all these areas. So we got to be very careful with moving parts and pieces that way. So that goes as kind of what we are doing. So this kind of goes back to the planning stages. Okay, sorry, I'll take a step back here. I don't think I would be a good safety professional if I didn't have the hierarchy of control somewhere in my presentation. So as we can see on this slide, that if we could eliminate the hazard or design it out, that is always the best option for us. If we can't do that, we want to substitute it out. If we can't use something less hazardous, we want to engineer some controls, isolate that, or provide some sort of guarding. If we can't do that and that's not effective enough, then we need to go to some type of administrative control, some training or work scheduling. And the very last thing we always want to rely on is our personal protective equipment, right? So here's another image of just another way of explaining that. We want to spend the bulk of our time up in the very top of that. So as we were in the process of designing this facility, we wanted to make sure that we can do some prevention by design, or prevention through design. So this is a prevention by design, or through design, is a concept that encourages the design engineers to consider safety of the construction and maintenance workers during the design of the project. So that way, as we are building these facilities, we want to be looking forward to the future of our safety, future safety of our employees and of others as they're working in and around our facility. And I borrowed this image from a NIOSH publication, and as you can see, it's not really extremely new, but it is something that we wanted to make sure that it is part of our process. So as we were designing our facilities, we wanted to make sure that we incorporated some new safety features into our new facilities. And as you can see, this slide here, it goes through it. And if you're up here in that conceptual design, it is much easier to make changes than when you're down here in this construction. And we always get the ability to influence our safety is by changing those in the design or in that process. And once the building is built or the facility is ready to go, then it's more difficult to change some of those things. So part of our process, we've designed some of our safety features. One of those being the image on the left is designs of one of our new buildings. And as you can see, our roof level here is at 4,273 feet, and our parapet wall is at 4,278 feet. So we have a 5-foot parapet wall. The image on the right is one of our existing buildings that we have had to go back and redesign a guardrail system around our building. And as you can see, we have a fan and a switch just right on the edge. So our employees have had to go and work right near the edge of that facility. The parapet wall on the existing building is about 18 inches right here. And it took us quite a bit of time and money and effort and to be able to redesign this guardrail that goes around the outside of the building and then have it installed. So it is always better, like on our new buildings, that we'll have some of those parapet or those safety features designed into those buildings. Just another one that I wanted to talk about really quick was, now you can see a design of our blower building here and our electrical room. And then this is the room over here, this arc flash room. Oh, wrong button, but as we wanted to make sure that we were designing. So in our current facility, we have electrical rooms or MCC rooms in all of our buildings. A lot of those are smaller, and so we have got a lot of stuff and not a lot of room to pass through them. Also, some of those areas have become major thoroughfares as our guys going to and from different parts of our facility. So in our new building, we have designed these to be bigger, have more space, and have opportunities so that we're not going to collect the items and stuff in those electrical rooms. But another thing that we've designed is this arc flash room that some of our electricians can go through and change out some of the buckets or some of the switches as they work in those cabinets. Now, in our existing buildings, that's sometimes a hazard that we go through as they have to put on the 40 cal suits and do that. But now with this new design, they could go into this room and be able to mechanically put those buckets in and those switches into and out of that facility without having to have those exposures directly involved there. Now, I know that some of these designs, it costs a little bit more to build a 5-foot parapet wall than it does to build an 18-inch parapet wall, or to build this art flash room. It costs money, but you just want to be able to prevent those injuries or those hazards, or exposure to those hazards in the future. And be able to design these buildings or these facilities so that they are ready to go and up to code and ready for safe features as we use these facilities in the future. So I just can't stress enough the importance of designing safety into our buildings as we go from there. So that is kind of what we have done is at our facility, and we wanted to make sure that you guys everybody could be aware, see what we have done, and see that what we are doing to help prevent injuries and maintain a safe facility during the construction phase of our process.
Thanks, Isaac. We got one question in from the audience.
Okay.
Can you comment on how the facility's emergency action plan would have been put into effect with the earthquake this spring?
Yeah, so the earthquake was with everything else that has been going on in our facility, was a bit of a surprise to us. At that point, we didn't have a lot of our projects going. We did have a couple of them ongoing as well. So part of our emergency action plan with our contractors is they have designated meeting points for all of their employees, and then we have designated points for our employees. So we were able to gather all of our employees together, and the contractors gathered their employees at their designated sites to be able to make sure that they were, and then not relying on communications, but we sent people out to their designated areas to be able to communicate with them and make sure that everybody was accounted for. And then we kind of told them to hold tight in those areas until we were able to assess our facility. And as we gathered our employees together, we were able to then go out and make sure, assess our facility. And some of the contractors determined that they were just going to dismiss all of their employees at that time. Others stayed around until we gave them the clearance to go back to work in some of their areas that they were working in. But it was paramount or very critical that we were able to get a hold of those employees and account for their whereabouts in our facility. We do have a lot of below ground tunnels and things that we just need to make sure that everybody is accounted for with that. And then again, we needed to assess our facility and make sure that our structures were intact and before we are able to let the contractors go back to work. Anything else with that, Phil? Or
Yeah, we did sustain some damage to one of our, we store the biosolids we produce in silos, large suspended silos. One of those did come off its moorings, but that was really the only
significant structural damage
we sustained.
So,
but we were able to get out and go through all the buildings, look at the piping and the walls and roofs and so forth within just a few hours,
and
make sure everything was safe.
Absolutely.
And we do have several engineers on staff and then our safety department. And so we were able to look at everything pretty quickly.
Yep.
Very good. Thank you so much, Phil. Isaac?
So one thing we did find, though, we had some power problems. We have emergency generators, and we also have a bulk fuel storage system. One of the things we really learned was we didn't have the capacity to move fuel from our bulk storage tank to all the generators quick enough. So we ended up buying a fuel trailer to solve that problem. But
yep, lessons learned.
That was a learning lesson.
Okay.
And once again, thank you so much, Phil and Isaac. We really appreciate you taking the time to walk through all of the details on effective safety planning. There's quite a bit there to be involved with and to understand. We're going to go ahead and move on to the next presentation at this point. And the next presentation will be with JD Ashby, who is Vice President of Claims for WCF Insurance. JD is a graduate of the University of Utah with a bachelor's degree in organizational communication and a Juris Doctorate. JD is involved in complex workers' compensation claims that are evaluated by the Utah Labor Commission. JD will present on the topic, Anatomy of a Major Workplace Injury, and the best practices to mitigate the severity of these claims. And with that, we'll go ahead and turn the time over to JD. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Daryl. I hope everybody can hear me all right. I'm going to make sure that we're showing the right screen. Let's see. Okay, can you see that slide all right?
No, we're seeing a manager's meeting. We're seeing Outlook reminders right now. Is what we're seeing.
That's what I want you all to see when I hold my manager meetings, if at all possible.
Perfect.
All right, did that switch it?
Closer, we see the slide and the presenter view.
Okay.
Now we
toggling.
see just the presenter view. So if you do the display settings and swap,
We're homing
slide,
here.
that should get us there.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
We all the way home, Taylor?
We are indeed.
I'm not used to hitting the menu and seeing like 6 different screen options. We're not launching space shuttles here. I'm just trying to affect some insurance claims. So thank you for having me. I was actually really pleased to be able to catch the back 9 of that last presentation. I appreciate the insights from Phil and Isaac. It's really actually encouraging to hear the amount of thought and time and effort that goes into keeping workers safe, because that's the business that we try to be in at WCF Insurance too. As Daryl mentioned, my name is JD Ashby. I have worked for WCF Insurance for the last 18 years, actually. I started here as a summer law clerk, actually, between my first and second years of law school at the University of Utah, right after the Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City. And if you had asked me then what my career would look like going forward, I wouldn't have guessed I'd still be here 18 years later. In fact, at the same time, at the beginning of my second year of law school, actually, I accepted a position as a graduate assistant in the compliance office of the athletic department of the University of Utah. And I tried to keep both of those jobs while I finished up law school. And I only bring that up because if talking about insurance starts to get too boring, Taylor, you can always just wave the white flag. We can have a discussion of all the trouble Rick Majerus got himself into and all the effort we put in to try to get him out of it for a couple of years. But Daryl had initially asked me, actually back in the spring, to talk about the anatomy of a major workplace injury. And it's a dense topic, and I hope that most of you don't have frequent occasion to deal with major workplace injuries, but they're life-changing when they happen. And then, of course, March happened, and we bumped this conference. And in the meantime, Daryl asked me to add a dimension to my comments to include a COVID-19 claims update. I appreciate Phil and Isaac because they gave me a little new vocabulary. And I can tell you that with COVID right now in the workers' comp world, there's a lot of biosolids going on. So it's a very timely topic. And I'm so involved in it from day to day that it wasn't a huge lift to add some content. The only thing I really had to do was update my main graphic to make sure that it was appropriate to that COVID update. So I want to build in a little bit of time at the end. I know that a lot of people are up against a lot of unique situations when it comes to COVID in the workplace, and the workers' comp layer to that is only one piece. But if you have curiosities about how your workers' comp program is affected or how your employees might be affected by COVID from an industrial perspective, I want to leave enough time that we can discuss that, not so much because I have the answers, but because I'm curious to hear what you're running up against and what your questions are. I mentioned that I began here at WCF in the legal department. I spent 10 years as a litigator, litigating disputed workers' compensation claims in front of the Labor Commission and appellate courts. From there, I actually went and did a 3.5-year tour of duty in our HR department. And that was a really fascinating 3 years. I miss it in a lot of ways. And I learned a lot of things in HR, a lot of things about being an employer of people and the responsibilities that are involved there. Those things have served me well since I came to claims about 5 years ago. But it's been interesting to look at these COVID claims and actually these major workplace injuries through the lens of somebody who's been in an HR seat and worried about our obligation as an employer. And I'm sure that a lot of you have similar thoughts and concerns, will have similar thoughts as we go through some of this content. So please feel free to throw your questions into the chat, and I'll try to build enough space on the back end that we can go over whatever's on your mind. So first of all, the impact of large claims. We're going to go over a little bit of the more trivial side. It's impactful, but in the grand scheme, more trivial side in a minute. But I always like to point out that the impact of large claims is primarily on the person who's injured. A major workplace injury affects a lot of people, but nobody more than the person who's injured. And those effects are not just physical. We see catastrophic claims more than I wish we did. And they really affect 5 components of an injured worker's life. The first, the obvious one, like I said, is the physical. We just got a new claim for a person who was severely hurt after falling from a height and fracturing his cervical spine in several places. And early signs are this person will never walk again, and in all likelihood is going to be a complete quadriplegic. That's a very devastating but easy to illustrate physical effect of that accident. And usually those are the most obvious and frankly, the easiest to identify resources to help with, because it's mostly just getting the injured worker the medical attention they need. But a lot of times it's not the most impactful element of a major workplace injury. Obviously, there's the psychological impact. Once you get past the physical effects of a major injury, the injured worker's identity is severely affected from a number of different angles. And psychologically, it's a giant hurdle in a lot of cases to come to terms with the fact that you're severely hurt and that your life is going to be potentially different going forward. And obviously, when we talk about major workplace injuries, I would include in that category workplace fatalities. And in that case, obviously the physical dimension of the injuries are fatal, and that psychological impact is on all of the injured workers' loved ones. But fortunately, we don't have too many fatalities per year. We're actually not having a great year in 2020. I don't think anything's great in 2020. But in an average year, we have about a dozen fatalities over roughly 20,000 claims. So it's more common to see catastrophic injuries. And in those injuries, like I said, the psychological impact is tremendous and is often overlooked in the early stages because of that obvious physical impact. The third one is the social effect that it has on the injured worker. Obviously, these things are simple and straightforward and likely evident to everybody, but it's easy in the panic and the turmoil of a catastrophic injury to forget that this incident has done violence to these dimensions of an injured worker's identity, including their social identity. This gentleman that I mentioned that was recently injured is a sole breadwinner for his family, and his identity is a father and a provider and a husband, and he's having to face the reality that he can't do that the way he always has, the way he's done in his career for about the last 35 years. And that is massive and significant and important to understand if you're going to affect a good recovery. The fourth element there, of course, is the financial impact. A major workplace injury very, very often affects the injured worker's ability to earn a living, temporarily hits the pause button on their traditional income, and that's where workers' compensation comes in. But workers' compensation is not built to be a full wage replacement. It has maximums. If you're earning more than the state average weekly wage, then you're going to lose money on work comp disability benefits. And so there can be a giant financial impact, both in terms of the immediate effect and its impact on future earning power. And then, of course, the injured worker's work. All of us have a huge portion of our identity wrapped up into what we do. And when that's interrupted, and all of a sudden, the thing that you've worked your whole life to master is either dramatically interrupted or altogether foreclosed, that's a giant effect. And so, well, like I said, we'll go over some of the details, the mechanics, the best practices. I never want to lose sight in the role that I'm in, and I talk to our managers and adjusters about the fact that we can't ever lose sight of the fact that these are human beings that are suffering a real life incident. And when we talk about these major workplace injuries, the large claims, they are life changing. It's not just someone's life, but it's somebody's life and every life that depends on that life that it's affected when you have a major workplace injury. And that's why I'm so encouraged when I hear the amount of effort and time and thought being put into safety measures, because obviously the best management of a major workplace injury is not to have a major workplace injury in the first place, because once it happens, we can scramble all we want, we can do what we can to put Humpty Dumpty back together, but you can't undo all the effects of that injury. I should have mentioned at the outset that in my role in claims, I work with our adjusters here in Utah. We do have offices in Sandy and in St. George, but we also have offices in Las Vegas and Boise and just outside of Sacramento. And we also have staff in Arizona and Colorado. And so we see these major workplace injuries across the Western states. And really, we have risk placed across the country. So we see these in all different areas of the country. And these 5 dimensions are the same, no matter where you are, no matter what your workers' compensation law looks like. These 5 dimensions of a large workplace injury are always there. The person who's injured has to find a way to deal with each of these 5. And our role as an insurance carrier is to help that happen as quickly and as well as possible. So getting into the mechanics of it, again, none of this is rocket science. A lot of these things are going to be common sense, but I back in March when I first talked to Daryl, or earlier this year, I actually sat down with one of our long tenured claim managers here. He had been with the company for over 35 years, was kind of the oracle of the claims department, and for about the last 25 years had managed what we call our catastrophic claims committee internally. That's a committee that's met for a quarter of a century. They meet once a month. They review every one of our large losses, and it's a multidisciplinary committee made up of the adjuster handling the claim, that adjuster's manager, 2 of our most tenured claims managers sit in on that meeting. The vice president of our litigation department or litigation division within our legal department is part of that committee. The manager of our medical case management group, who's a registered nurse, actually heads that committee. We have our underwriters phase through those meetings, and our loss actuary sits in on every one of those meetings. So every one of these large claims is reserved and reviewed collaboratively with that multidisciplinary panel of experts every single month. And they're also consulted in between meetings when the adjuster runs up against a difficult problem on those claims. And so this gentleman had been running that committee for 25 years, and I figured nobody knew better than he did what advice to give about major workplace injuries. And a lot of what I have in these next couple of slides is based on what he told me. Well, in the meantime, of course, COVID hit, and one of the things we did as a company at WCF was offer an early retirement incentive for long-term employees. And this manager of ours, his name was Mark, unfortunately took that retirement incentive and retired from the company at the end of June. And so I hope that I haven't mangled any of what he told me in the ensuing months, that my memory's been okay and my notes from back then are on. But one thing that he reminded us on his way out the door was that these claims are where we really have an opportunity to help and correct course for somebody whose life has been changed by a major injury. And I want to emphasize that again, that these are human beings whose welfare we need to look out for before we worry about the financial side of what a major claim means. So first of all, you have phase 1, which is the emergency, what I call the emergency phase. There are a handful of things, and this first walk through this slide is intended to be from an employer's perspective. And again, I tried to put myself back in the HR department thinking about what would happen if we had a major workplace injury here. And obviously day one, don't think about it, get the medical care that the person needs. And when I say get and support the necessary medical care, when it comes to these large claims and you're enlisting emergency help, you as the employer are going to be a key and maybe the only point of contact for those emergency responders in the first instance. And so providing the information that the doctors and paramedics and others might need, that is key, and it's a key piece of your role as an employer, but also making sure that your program that you've planned and plotted out is followed, including little details like drug testing, making sure a post-accident drug test happens, and interfacing with supporting the medical care is really key. Communicating with the employee and the family. Now, one thing that we do see from time to time that's heartbreaking is employers, particularly smaller employers, who have either no emergency contact information for their employees or outdated emergency contact information. And when an injured worker is severely hurt to the point where they can't communicate, or worse, when they're killed, imagine not being able to reach that person's family to let them know that it happened. Again, that when it happens at work, that obligation falls primarily to you as the employer. And if you don't have up-to-date emergency contact information, which again, we've run into, and it's very difficult, particularly for some populations of workers who either work in the field or for whatever reason are distant from the center of the operations. Getting a hold of that family is both vital and very difficult if you don't have that up-to-date contact information. You immediately become a lifeline to the family when you're the employer in a major workplace injury. And so one thing you can do before that accident happens is have a process in place for making sure that anytime an employee's emergency contact information changes, there's a mechanism to force a change in the record of that emergency contact in some centralized place. Here at WCF, we have built into our payroll system both periodic reminders that go out that say, hey, is this emergency contact information up to date? And then reminders that go out that say, if your emergency contact information changes, make sure that it's up to date in our HR and payroll system. So have something like that in place, because as I mentioned, we have run into places where we can't get a hold of the family or the closest contact, and it is very, very heartbreaking to deal with those situations. Immediately gauge the impact on your other employees. When there's a large accident at work, obviously it's going to affect people, particularly people who were near it, who witnessed it, or were close to the person that was hurt. We see instances where paramedics have to treat coworkers for shock because of the severity and the trauma of what they've witnessed. So don't lose sight of how the large claim affects your other employees, and that's a key thing to get a feel for as soon as the injured employees' immediate needs are being taken care of by the medical professionals. So then we have what I call phase 1A, which is urgency. Now, again, this manager I referenced a minute ago, Mark, he had a saying that I've taken to heart for the last close to 20 years. He always said, insurance is not an emergency. And that is a very key principle to understand. We insure a lot of things that are related to emergencies, but insurance itself is not an emergency. And one of the things that drives me a little crazy in some legal advertising and things is when attorney ads say, hey, your first call after an accident should be to your attorney. I say the opposite when it comes to these major claims in your insurance carrier. The person's welfare is in the pole position. You need to take care of the person. Insurance, we're there to pay for it. We're not there to deliver it. And so insurance itself is not an emergency, but when you get into these large claims, it's the closest that it gets to an emergency. And so I put in this 1A phase to notify your insurer. Now, if you've got an insurance carrier like WCF, or if you're part of a trust, or if you're self-insured and there's a claims administrator who handles your claims, doesn't matter. I use the word insurer in here because that's my frame of reference, but getting notice to whoever's going to handle your claim is key. And I'm not talking about at this point filing a claim, although you may file a claim at this phase. But just getting a heads up to your insurer in these large claims is massive. We had a claim a couple of years ago where a truck driver up in northern Utah actually pulled over to help another driver who was stranded having car trouble, and being a good Samaritan, and the stranded driver's car caught fire and severely burned this truck driver who was trying to help. And obviously had to be life flighted down to a trauma center in Salt Lake. And because the employer called us right away and said, we've had this awful incident, we didn't have the claim yet, but we have a staff of nurses who are extremely familiar with all the providers throughout the state. And the director of our medical case management unit was able to get a hold of the burn center at the University of Utah, get a hold of the doctors that would be treating the injured worker. Well, all this happening while the injured worker still on a helicopter being flown into the trauma center, cleared the runway for all the kind of red tape administrative things that may have held up the family. And by the time the injured worker arrived at the trauma center, they had all the information that they needed because it came from the employer through the insurer to the hospital. And those are the sorts of things that can happen if we know about the claim right away. So when I say notify your insurer, now, not every insurer has a staff of nurses, not every insurer or trust or administrator is going to be able to scramble those types of resources in such a short period. But there's no harm in your insurer knowing about the claim, and there can be a lot of good. And like I said, it's not about filing a claim at this point. You don't need to worry about gathering all the detail that you gather when you file a typical claim. But this is a place also where your agent, person you have the relationship with, person who looks out for your insurance needs and who speaks both languages, both the language of your business and the language of insurance, can be an extremely crucial go-between here. So even just placing that call to your agent, the person that you know, and saying, we just had this large incident, please do whatever you got to do. A good agent will know exactly who to call at the insurance company to get those resources kind of springing into motion. And so when I say notify your insurer, that is often happens, and a lot of times it happens best when that notification comes through your insurance agent. And then finally, and most of you will know this, obviously, in those major workplace injuries, you need to notify OSHA. If it is a fatality, that notification has to get to OSHA within 8 hours. If it's something that requires hospitalization or it involves an amputation, which is almost always going to involve a hospitalization as well, or an injured worker has lost an eye, those notifications have to get to OSHA within 24 hours. So then you move into phase 2, which is the critical phase. Think of the accident scene as a crime scene on your favorite procedural crime drama. Preserve the scene and the evidence. So don't let employees go move equipment. Certainly don't delete the surveillance video, any other contemporaneous evidence like that. Just put that on deep freeze for a minute, because there are going to be investigations that happen. Obviously, OSHA is going to do their investigation, but also your claims adjuster is going to need to gather some detail, and we may look into the claim for the possibility of third-party recoveries to get some of your claims money back. And so preserving that accident scene and any evidence associated with the accident is crucial and helps us get a better result in the claim. You know, at this point, if you didn't do it in that phase 1A and the immediate aftermath of the accident, this is a time to file the workers' comp claim. Just by filing the claim and getting a claim number that the injured worker can give to their medical providers, that family can avoid a lot of headache going forward. Coordinate closely with the claims adjuster. Early on in a major workplace accident, you should become best friends with your claims adjuster. That relationship, that fusion point between you and your claims adjuster is going to be what makes or breaks the success of the claim. And so establish that relationship early. Make sure that you're on the same page and understand where things are going. Take witness statements. Identifying the people that witnessed the incident and would be able to help you understand what happened is key. The claims adjuster can help with these witness statements. They do a lot of them, and there's key information that we need to know that overlaps with key information that you need to know and that OSHA needs to know. So that's a good place to involve the claims adjuster. Respond quickly to investigative requests, meaning if we send a subrogation investigator out there to explore third-party recovery possibilities, obviously if OSHA has an investigator out there, if we send a claims rep to help understand the accident better, or even things as simple as your claims adjuster is going to need wage and hour records. They're going to need certain personnel records. Get those requests filled as quickly as you can. Delays in those types of requests can slow down a claim at key points. And so be very responsive and get those things to whoever's asking for them as quickly as you can. Okay, now you're going to see this recurring theme throughout. Maintain that contact with the injured employee and their family. Now, the injured employee can communicate. Obviously, that's your primary contact point. But letting the family know that you're worried about that injured worker goes a long way toward not letting this accident drift your relationship with the employee into some adversarial position. Keep that contact up. It's a key principle of workers' compensation is that the longer someone is disengaged from work, as our general counsel says, the longer that a satellite ship is floating free away from the mothership, the bigger risk you have of that claim going sideways and ending up in a bad place. So maintain that contact, express your concern, reach out, send emails, make phone calls, send a basket of mini muffins. It doesn't matter how you reach out, just make it clear that your concern is with that injured worker and their family. And then again, keep a close eye on those other affected employees. Don't forget about them. If there were people who were directly affected by that accident, check up on them too. Make sure they're doing okay. Work with their supervisor and their coworkers to make sure things are going all right there. And then finally, phase 3 is the management phase. Once again, doesn't end. Keep that contact. Do not lose your connection point with the employee and their family. Communicate with your agent, your underwriter, and your adjuster. This claim is going to have a financial impact on you one way or another. Your agent, again, becomes a very, very key pivot point and is going to be your liaison and your expert in helping you understand how that claim is going to affect you down the line. If you're fully insured, so say you're a WCF insured, the way that the NCCI treats that claim in your EMOD is going to matter to you down the road, and it's not going to be immediate. You're going to have an 18-month lag, and for budgeting and all sorts of other reasons, it's key to understand exactly what that impact is going to be. And communicating with your agent and through your agent to your underwriter and adjuster and directly with your underwriter and adjuster can help you understand and anticipate the financial impact of that claim. Monitor medical and financial developments. It's of the same vein. Make sure you're up to date on what's going on. Keep a look at your loss runs. If you have questions about something on the loss run, call your claims adjuster, call your agent, be literate in the claim, because your literacy helps us. Anticipate the potential return to work options. If this person's catastrophically hurt, but there's a possibility of them returning to work at some time down the line, obviously it's not only a good way to mitigate your loss on the claim, but it's fantastic for the injured worker in recovering from those 5 components that are insulted when a major accident happens. And so if it looks like there may be a way to bring them back to work, if you just get a little bit creative and have a little foresight, start thinking about that early. Look at ways that you might be able to modify a workstation or modify a schedule or juggle some things to bring the person back to work, even if that's not an immediate thing. Having the plan in place will serve you very, very well when the time comes that the person can return to work. Evaluate leave issues. Obviously, this is another thing that came up in my life in HR. FMLA can run concurrently with workers' comp, and so make sure that you're tracking the time that the injured worker is out so that you know how and whether to apply the same thing to an FMLA clock. For that very reason, when it comes time to consider return to work, or if anything else even slightly complex arises, consulting employment counsel can be a very, very key step. Talking it through with your labor attorney, your city attorney, your county attorney, whoever advises you on employment issues, there are going to be things that have to be considered in concert. For instance, the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act Amendments Act, and some other things that have to be considered side by side with decisions in a catastrophic injury are key places where having a good employment attorney giving you counsel will make a huge difference. And then finally, this comes back to that safety consciousness piece. Evaluate the risk of similar injuries in the future. Go do a postmortem, look at the accident site, talk to witnesses, figure out what dials you can turn to reduce the risk of an accident like that happening again down the line. And then finally, I'm going to really rifle through this piece. This is just from our perspective as the insurer. The same 3 phases, but what are we going to do at the same time? We're going to support that necessary medical care too. I mentioned we try to spring into action and get that go through as quickly as possible. Our goal, our obsessive focus in the claims department that we reinforce over and over with our claims adjusters, that our focus needs to be on, in every claim, recovery and return to work. It's not cost savings. It's not some financial metric. It's recovery and return to work. We're not going to get every person back to work, and in some claims there will be no real recovery. But if your focus is on recovery and return to work on every claim, then you're going to get a much better outcome on a lot of claims, and you're not going to lose sight of the big picture because of some small floating by in the big picture trivial thing. So we'll communicate with the employee and the family as well. When we get into phase 2, we're going to come help you examine that scene. We're going to look through the evidence. We're going to make a compensability determination on the workers' comp claim, but we're also going to identify subrogation opportunities. We're going to scramble those jets, deploy the support resources in almost every one of these large claims. That's going to include a nurse, a case manager to be involved and help shepherd the injured worker through the medical aspects of their claim. We're going to take witness statements. Once again, it's on every list. We're going to maintain that contact with the injured worker and their family. And then we're going to circle the wagons on our side, get that multidisciplinary group together and develop a management plan for the claim. Finally, into the management phase, same thing. We're going to maintain that contact. We're going to communicate with you and your agent, your underwriter. We're going to monitor those same medical developments. We're going to manage the case reserves. That's what I mentioned before. Be dialed into that. Understand it. Ask us if you have questions. Help us understand pieces that doesn't look like we understand. We want to get those case reserves right. And those are on those large claims are going to be set within those first 6 months and may not directly impact you until a year or so later. So collaborate with you and whatever your team looks like, safety professionals, risk management professionals. We're going to work with you on potential return to work options, and we can, WCF, we have just a crackerjack staff of safety professionals who can help evaluate that risk of future injury. And just from the financial perspective, what do these large claims mean to you and mean to us? Just to give it a little bit of perspective, in a typical year, I looked at this for about the last 7 years, it's almost the same every single year. The largest 10% of our claims, the most expensive 10% of claims we have, constitute 87% of our claims cost. These large claims drive everything. And so understanding, avoiding, and managing these large claims well will do nothing but good for your program. Okay. Really, really quick, let me hit on COVID. I'm not going to go through this for lack of time, but a lot of states have passed laws, presumption laws, to make it so that certain brands of workers are presumed to have acquired COVID at work if they test positive. Utah is one of those. Now, this is what the Utah presumption looks like. Again, I'm going to go really quickly. First of all, I have to correct that graphic. I prefer this way of looking at our state. But the Utah presumption says it applies to what it calls first responders. And by the definition of the bill that was passed just a couple of months ago in a special session of the Labor Commission, those first responders fall into 2 categories. There's your textbook traditional, what we all think of as first responders, which is law enforcement officers, EMTs, advanced EMTs, paramedics, firefighters, dispatchers, correctional officers. But there's a second brand of first responders that's really the healthcare first responders. And the new presumption law that passed, House Bill 5006 was the numbered bill in the legislature, says people employed by these hospitals, surgical centers, all these types of healthcare clinics, including dental offices, chiropractic offices, pharmacies, laboratories that do testing on human specimens. There's a laundry list. But it's interesting because the language the legislature chose was not the job that the person does, but it's who employs the injured worker. So we're running up against some strange situations in Utah because we can have, for instance, someone who's employed by the University of Utah College, the College of Medicine, works at the University of Utah Hospital. So they're working in a healthcare facility, and they're doing a healthcare job. I mean, a lot of physicians, physicians assistants, and nurses, and physical therapists, medical assistants, but their employer is not a healthcare facility. Their employer is a college. And so they can be working shoulder to shoulder with somebody who does qualify for the presumption, and they themselves would not qualify for the presumption. It's a strange dynamic that's eked out the side of this. And you kind of as a parting note, this is the Utah Occupational Disease Act. I always hesitate to put this much text in a slide because a picture is worth 1,000 words unless it's a picture of 1,000 words. But this is just an excerpt from the Utah Occupational Disease Act. The upshot of this is pandemics were never intended to be in the workers' compensation system. They're too big, they're too unpredictable, and it would gouge employers if we charge them for the possibility of a pandemic. So there's a section right in our our Occupational Disease Act, and frankly, in every workers' comp law through the state, either through their statute or through case law, there's this limitation that says that if something is common to the general public, this is what it says in Utah, that the compensation will be reduced and limited if the exposure is something to which the general public is commonly exposed. And so that theoretically eliminates a pandemic from workers' comp, but those presumption laws bring it back in. Obviously, I could spend all day on that one. I don't want to run past my time. So the kind of Reader's Digest takeaway on those COVID claims is they are complicated. They raise a lot of questions, particularly if you have first responders that you work with. I would welcome the chance to have a conversation with any of you about things that are coming up in your world, or things you're curious about, or things that you fear coming up in this new COVID life. So with that, I appreciate the time. I hope that something I said was of some limited value. And again, if there are any questions, Taylor, did we get anything on the chat?
Yeah, I got a couple of questions in on the chat. Let me pull these over. So first question is, how does the appeal process work with the Labor Commission, and how many claims do you typically see getting appealed?
Okay, so if we deny a claim, an injured worker can file an application for hearing at the Labor Commission. That's just an administrative process, and an administrative law judge is going to look at it and make a decision one way or the other. And a lot of times those decisions involve referring the case to a medical panel, which the Labor Commission appoints, and then that medical panel issues an opinion, and the judge is almost always going to base their decision on that panel's opinion. If we're not satisfied with, if for some reason we've got a legal issue with the decision from the ALJ, we can file a motion for review to the Labor Commission. That either goes to the Labor Commission Appeals Board, which is a board of 3 people that's selected by the Utah Labor Commissioner, or we can send that the motion for review directly to the Labor Commissioner. And then if we don't designate, then one or the other can hear it. It's up to the Commissioner. If we want to proceed beyond that motion for review level, the administrative level, then our next appeal opportunity is to the Utah Court of Appeals, and from there to the Utah Supreme Court. So there's no district court involvement in the direct workers' comp questions. Those go from the ALJ to the administrative agency and the Labor Commission, from there to the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals to the Supreme Court's final remedy. Does that answer the question? Oh, and then there was a second part about how many do we see being appealed. In an average year, WCF as an insurer, he said that we get about 20,000 claims a year. In an average year, we deny right around 5% of those. It's a pretty low percent. And then of those 5%, about probably 25 to 28% of those are appealed to the Labor Commission. So it's a pretty small number, a percentage of a percentage, once you start seeing claims that are going to, to be reviewed by the Labor Commission.
All right. It looks like it's about the COVID presumptions. And they're asking, do you see the inverse of the situation you described? For example, a janitorial staff that is employed by a hospital qualifying for presumption, while, it's kind of the opposite of what you described with being a college employee is what it sounds like.
Absolutely. And that's why I said I could go on for this one about all day. This is actually the second presumption law that we've had in Utah. There was the first one that the legislature passed. They hooked in some definitions into the federal, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, actually the FMLA amendments in that act, and said, this is what a first responder means. And it was so broad because it was hooked to that FMLA provision that we looked at it and said, if you were a janitor cleaning the English literature department at Southern Utah University, you would qualify for this presumption because Southern Utah University technically has a nursing school, and you are a Southern Utah University employee, and you may have never been anywhere near a medical facility, never anywhere near a patient. And even if you were a contractor, that brought you all the way into that presumption. Legislature realized that that was too much breadth, and so they passed this replacement bill. But because it links to who you're employed by, we absolutely have those cases. We've gotten about 300 COVID claims in WCF in Utah, and we have exactly those claims you just described, and the presumption does apply. They can be, a medical records tech in the medical facility with no interaction with patients, but because of the way the presumption's worded, they get the benefit of that presumption, where the doctor working up the hall from them does not, because they happen to be employed by somebody else.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time with us this morning.
Thank you.
Blake Hamilton will be our next presenter. Blake is a shareholder with Durham Jones and Pinniger. Blake's primary practice areas are civil rights litigation and government entity defense. He also serves as general counsel for the Utah Peace Officers Association and the National Institute of Jail Operations. And Blake will present to us on civil rights claims in the 21st century, which I think is no secret to any of us. It's become a very hot topic. So with that, we'll turn it over to you, Blake.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen here. So as I was thinking about this topic and what I could speak upon, obviously, as Brian just mentioned, all of a sudden, our country kind of had an interesting development happen over the summer while everyone was in pandemic. And that was the focus in on civil rights claims, and specifically a defense called qualified immunity. And so as I thought about what to talk about with respect to civil rights claims in the 21st century, I landed on deciding that I'd like to speak a little bit about qualified immunity and kind of use that as my focus of today's presentation. I'm used to presenting in a situation where I'm live, and so I'm used to having an interaction with the audience. So hopefully today we can have a discussion, even though we're doing this through technology. And if you have questions, please feel free to ask those questions through the chat feature, and we can talk. So I think this is, again, like I said, qualified immunity is one of the hottest topics in civil rights law today. And it's more than just lawyers that are talking about qualified immunity. Over 1,400 professional athletes, coaches, and executives recently signed a letter asking Congress to abolish qualified immunity. This included Tom Brady, Steve Kerr, Drew Brees, and Greg Popovich. And here's a couple of excerpts from the Players Coalition letter, and I think it can kind of show you why they're looking at trying to have this abolished, and maybe some of their misunderstandings about what qualified immunity really is. It says qualified immunity has shielded some of the worst law enforcement officials in America. When police officers kill an unarmed man, when they beat a woman, or when they shoot a child, the people of this country must have a way to hold them accountable in a court of law. It is time for Congress to eliminate qualified immunity. Even TikTok, and you know you've made it big when TikTok starts discussing a certain topic, but even TikTok is discussing qualified immunity. One video called How Qualified Immunity Works has over 380,000 views, but the viral video clearly demonstrates that there are a lot of misunderstandings about what qualified immunity actually does. And I just would like to play this video for you. So I think that demonstrates one of the common misunderstandings about qualified immunity. We'll talk about how in the 10th Circuit.
Sorry to jump in, but we didn't have sound on that. So if you could just summarize the content of it, the sound didn't play through.
Oh, well, I'm sorry that the sound didn't play through. As you saw, there was an individual who repeatedly slapped himself, and the individual said, was playing law enforcement and then a commentator and then the person being slapped. And the person being slapped asked, "Hey, did you see that? He slapped me. I want him to be held liable." And the individual that was providing the commentary, or the mediator, I guess, with respect to this video, was jumping on and saying, well, has he done this before? And the person said, yes, he's done this before. Was he punished before? No, he wasn't punished before. Well, then he can't be held liable. And it just kind of kept repeating itself, saying, well, you just saw him. He just barely did slap me before this. And it just made the point of trying to say that police and law enforcement are special and therefore they can't be held liable. And I think it shows one of the common misunderstandings about what qualified immunity really is. It doesn't mean that a person is going to have to show to bring a successful civil rights claim that this individual had behaved in this way in the past and wasn't punished. That's not at all what qualified immunity. All it does, and we'll talk about it here in just a second, but all qualified immunity does is it grants government officials immunity in federal civil rights lawsuits unless the plaintiff can show that the government official violated plaintiff's civil rights and the right was clearly established in the law. That is all qualified immunity is. It's not an absolute immunity. It's limited to civil rights cases for monetary damages. What qualified immunity does not do is qualified immunity does not shield government officials from criminal charges. It's not a get out of jail free card. Qualified immunity does not prevent plaintiffs from seeking injunctive or declaratory relief. Qualified immunity does not protect individuals who violate clearly established rights. So again, it's not an absolute immunity. All it's saying is that in essence, that the government official acting that's asserting qualified immunity had to be put on notice that what they were doing was a violation of someone's clearly established rights. For example, the officers involved in the death of George Floyd, they were all criminally charged and cannot raise qualified immunity as a defense in their criminal case. So who does qualified immunity protect? And that's one of the important things for you as risk managers and city attorneys and attorneys for your municipalities is knowing that this is a very important defense and it impacts and affects multiple individuals that you work with on a daily basis. Qualified immunity protects the following individuals from civil liability, or potentially can protect the following individuals from civil liability: local and state government officials, public school teachers and administrators, law enforcement officers, social workers, prison guards or correction officers, state medical board inspectors, and other government employees. So in doing this the last 13 years and having this kind of be my area of expertise, these are some of the type of claims that I've seen where qualified immunity could apply. So free speech, and usually the way this is couched, or the way that a plaintiff will try to bring this type of claim, is through a chilling argument. For example, in the last year, I handled a case for Davis County in which an individual had been investigated for possible criminal charges, and he thought the investigation was done, and he decided that he wanted to go and complain about how he was treated through the investigation. And after that time, he was then interviewed by the detective because the investigation hadn't been completed. And he then raised the fact that he believed that interview was in essence being done to try to chill his free speech. And so he brought a civil rights section 1983 claim. We were able to get that dismissed because we were able to show that in no way was being brought. The interview was not happening to chill his speech. And one of the things that really helped us in that case was that we had a video of the recorded interview. So we not only had the audio, but we actually had video of the interactions, and you could see that this individual, was laughing and joking with the person providing the interview or doing the interview, and clearly was not feeling intimidated in any way. And the claim was dismissed. Excessive force claims, and that's usually the most common area where qualified immunity is raised as a defense. And this can range, in my experience, I've seen this range from simply handcuffing, an officer handcuffing an individual, and the individual claiming that the cuffing was excessive, to a push by an officer. I handled the case with Summit County in which a individual deputy who then became the sheriff was there to take an adult woman who was living with her mother in a trailer into custody for a mental health check. And as they entered into the trailer, the mother, in essence, decided at first that she was welcoming them because she was the one that had called for the welfare check. And as they obtained the daughter, who was in the back room of the trailer, and as they were walking through the living room area of the trailer, the mother decided to change her mind and interject, and she at that point stepped in between the officers and was trying to prevent them from taking her daughter. And at that point, the deputy, who then became the sheriff, simply did what I call the Heisman pose and just kind of brushed the mother aside, and she fell backwards and hit her head on a coffee table. And we asserted qualified immunity as a defense in that case, and were successful in getting the claim dismissed. It also includes use of force tools that officers may use, including things like a taser. I've handled multiple taser cases, or it handles cases where deadly force is used, where an officer may use their service weapon, and qualified immunity can be a defense in those type of cases. It also comes in play with unreasonable search and seizure cases, and that is one of the common areas that you'll see qualified immunity being a very helpful and successful tool to be able to dispatch of those type of cases. One of the cases that I worked on the very first part of my career is a case that actually went to the United States Supreme Court called Pearson versus Callahan. And earlier on in my slides, I showed you what qualified immunity is, what the test is, which is that a plaintiff has to assert that there is a constitutional violation, is the first prong, and the second prong being that it's clearly established. Well, in Pearson versus Callahan, the issue that made it to the Supreme Court was the issue of whether that test had to be followed in that order. Previous Supreme Court precedent had stated that a district court had to make the determination first whether the plaintiffs had alleged a constitutional violation. Because when you assert qualified immunity as a defendant, the burden then shifts to the plaintiff to be able to first establish that they're asserting a constitutional violation. And then under the Supreme Court precedent before Pearson versus Callahan, then the district court, after making the determination of whether there had been a constitutional violation, the Supreme Court at that or the district court at that point could turn its attention to whether it was clearly established in a sufficient way to put an officer or government official on notice that they were violating that constitutional right. Pearson versus Callahan involved the Central Utah Narcotics Task Force. They were going to execute they didn't have a warrant. They were working on a weekend. They became informed that there was a drug house. It was a trailer. And so they became informed by that because of an individual they had been working with who had gone to that place and secured drugs. They asked that individual, after giving him copious amounts of coffee to revive him, to go back into the trailer to see if they could get a transaction to take place where they could then enter the trailer and make it an arrest or a seizure. The key word was, I guess, there was a nice drum set in this trailer, and so they asked their informant to go in and asked to play the drums, and at that point they would know that there was drugs on the premises and that the transaction was taking place, and without a warrant they would go in. And they were operating on a legal principle at the time called consent once removed, meaning if a individual performs an action in front of either an informant or undercover cop, they give up their right to privacy, and the officers at that point can execute and seize. There was a circuit split at the time, meaning there were certain areas of the country that had found that this was a valid legal doctrine, consent once removed, and Utah and the 10th Circuit had not ever decided this and made a decision. Judge Paul Cassell, who was the district court judge at the time handling the case, found in favor of the officers and that consent once removed was a valid principle and that they were shielded from liability because of qualified immunity. That was appealed to the 10th Circuit, and the 10th Circuit reversed and remanded. The United States Supreme Court took it up on cert to make a decision of whether the officers were entitled to qualified immunity and whether the previous Supreme Court precedent of the test for qualified immunity was a rigid test or whether it should be relaxed and allowing district court judges to simply jump to the second prong of that test, meaning district courts looking at whether it was clearly established. The Supreme Court reversed the 10th Circuit's decision and remanded in a 9-0 decision, finding that the officers in this case were entitled to qualified immunity because it was not clearly established that consent once removed was not a valid legal doctrine. And so it was a very fascinating case to work on, and it basically showed that what the Supreme Court was concerned about was that the Supreme Court was concerned that throughout the country, district courts were making determinations because they were trying to follow the rigid two-step test about what a constitutional violation was. That was, I think the hope was when the Supreme Court had put that in place, was to make it clearer to officers and government officials what a constitutional violation was. But in essence, what was happening is that you had different areas of the country ruling about same, very similar behavior, and one court ruling that there was that behavior constituted a constitutional violation, and other areas of the country finding that was not a constitutional violation. So they did away with that and just allowed district courts to skip to that second prong, which is whether it was clearly established that the actions of the government official at the time were a constitutional violation. The next area that I've seen a lot of these claims where qualified immunity can be a very useful tool is discrimination or equal protection. And we'll talk about one of those a little later that I'm handling currently right now for Miller County in a sexual harassment case. The other area is unlawful arrests. I just recently handled a case that we received a decision from the 10th Circuit just this summer in which the individual was asserting a unlawful arrest. The individual had been a former highway patrolman who then became a criminal defense attorney, who then lost his bar license and had decided to show up at his son and daughter-in-law's custody proceeding where DCFS had taken his grandchildren into custody and decided to interject himself in the parking lot of the courthouse, in essence, to try to stop his DCFS from taking his grandchildren. He was arrested by the Davis County Sheriff's Office and taken into custody. He challenged the arrest. And one of the ways that he challenged the arrest was unfortunately, the arresting officer had cited to a disturbing the peace statute involving buses. And he thought that that somehow invalidated the fact that he'd met the elements of disturbing the peace in the parking lot of the courthouse. And so at that point, we were successful in filing a motion for summary judgment, asserting qualified immunity. Judge Parrish found in our favor, and the 10th Circuit also found in our favor. And that case has now been dispatched because of qualified immunity. Other areas are malicious prosecution. In malicious prosecution, there's also the absolute immunity that prosecutors have when prosecuting. Recently just handled the case for San Juan County, in which it got some news and some media coverage. It was a situation in which San Juan County prosecuted a woman and her husband were shutting the pen of a individual who was leasing land from the BLM, and in which the claim was that there was an attempt of wanton destruction of livestock because they had shut this gate, precluding cattle from going in and being able to get into this pen where the water trough was. The case was bound over, and ultimately the Court of Appeals reversed on the criminal case with respect to the wife, and the husband ultimately entered a plea. But the wife decided to file a malicious prosecution claim against San Juan County, which we were successful in getting to dismiss by asserting qualified immunity and absolute prosecutorial immunity. Cruel and unusual punishment is the final area. And this is what you think of when you think of an inmate and the claim that an inmate may make. Cruel and unusual punishment comes or stems from the Eighth Amendment. So a lot of times people get confused. A person does not become an inmate until they have actually been found guilty and sentenced. And only at that point do they become an inmate where they can assert an Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishment claim. Before that, the analysis falls underneath the Fourth and the 14th Amendment. But those are the type of claims or claims that get asserted against governmental entities where qualified immunity can be a useful tool in defending the claim. And that's why it's important for you to know about qualified immunity and why it's important for your employees to understand that they have that type of an immunity. So where does qualified immunity come from? Qualified immunity is a judge-made doctrine that was created by the Supreme Court in 1967, which it was an unlawful arrest case, and the case is called Pearson versus Ray. The facts of the case are fairly interesting. You had a group of priests that included black and white clergy walk into a segregated bus terminal. Two police officers stopped the priests and asked them to leave. The priests refused to leave, so they were arrested. Criminal charges were eventually dismissed, and the Jim Crow laws that were in place at the time were found to be invalid. The priests sued the police officers for unlawful arrest in violation of the Fourth Amendment. And the Supreme Court held, this holding became the first version of what we now know as qualified immunity, that a police officer is not liable when acting under a statute that he or she reasonably believed to be valid, but that was later held unconstitutional on its face or as applied. Basically, they called this a good faith immunity or a subjective test, and it really boiled down to what the individual officer or government official understood at the time. The aftermath of this case, the Supreme Court continued to expand this new qualified immunity. By 1974, the Supreme Court had expanded this new qualified immunity defense to all executive actions. And by 1982, the Supreme Court announced the modern day version of qualified immunity. The modern day version of qualified immunity test comes from the case Harlow versus Fitzgerald. The facts of that case is that Fitzgerald was an an analyst for the Air Force. He discovered a $2 billion in cost overruns that had been concealed by the Pentagon. He testified before Congress about the overruns, and he was later dismissed from the position with the Air Force. Fitzgerald claims he was fired in retaliation for his congressional testimony. President Nixon actually came out and said that he personally was responsible for firing Fitzgerald, but of course the White House later retracted or walked back those statements from the president. Fitzgerald sued President Nixon and his presidential aides for firing him in violation of his First Amendment free speech rights. And the Supreme Court held that Nixon's aides were performing a discretionary function and were entitled to qualified immunity. The modern day qualified immunity test was therefore born, and it stated that government officials, the holding from this case was that government officials performing discretionary functions generally are shielded from liability of civil damage insofar as their conduct does not violate clearly established statutory or constitutional rights of which a reasonable person would have known. So the two prongs, as we discussed earlier, are constitutional violations, clearly established law. And again, after Pearson versus Callahan, a district court judge can jump to the second prong there and just decide the case on whether it was clearly established law. Clearly established law is an area that has become kind of a controversial part of this test, because what does clearly established law mean? The Supreme Court, in its later decisions after Harlow, the decisions regarding qualified immunity usually focus in on what clearly established means. In Ashcroft versus Al-Kid, the United States Supreme Court in 2011 defined clearly established law should be defined as not at a high level of generality. In Anderson versus Creighton, the United States Supreme Court found that clearly established law must be particularized to the facts of the case, and that ultimately what the court is looking at is that government officials should not be punished for conduct when they did not have any notice that their actions were unlawful. And that's really what the clearly established prong is. It's a notice prong. It's whether the government official had notice. So recent high-profile incidents involving police officers has put qualified immunity in the spotlight. There's been public criticism of qualified immunity, which has intensified over the last several months. Protests across the country for police reform have called for the end of qualified immunity using these high-profile incidents. And we've seen across the country some district court judges rendering some very interesting opinions regarding qualified immunity. In a recent decision called Jamison versus McClendon, you had a judge, Reeve, who made a ruling that, again, if you haven't had a chance to review it, you should take a chance to review the case, because he goes through a bunch of what's going on in the country, a bunch of the cases that have happened in our country to try to make his point. Judge Reeve is actually, I'm currently the president-elect for the Federal Bar Association for the state of Utah, and Judge Reeve, who rendered this decision, is going to be a guest speaker at our BYU chapter, Federal Bar Association chapters CLE that they're going to be putting on this fall. And the facts of the case of Jamison versus McClendon were as follows. You had Clarence Jamison, a black man who was pulled over while driving his Mercedes. The officer claimed his license tags were not visible, and the officer then tried multiple times to get Jamison to consent to a search. This included the officer lying to Jamison about receiving a call reporting that there were drugs in the vehicle, the officer promising to ignore small quantities of drugs if he was able to conduct a search, and at one point, the officer actually reaching into Jamison's vehicle while asking for consent to search the vehicle. Jamison refused multiple times, but eventually he gave in after being stopped for nearly 2 hours, and the officer then searched the vehicle and found nothing illegal. And so Mr. Jamison then brought his Section 1983 claim asserting Fourth Amendment right violations. The district court's holding was that the officer violated Jamison's Fourth Amendment rights because the consent to search was involuntary, but the officer did not violate clearly established law and was entitled to qualified immunity. The district courts found that there was no precedent that would have placed the constitutional question beyond debate. And I think that is quite questionable, to be honest. Judge Reeve dismissed the case based on qualified immunity, and then he called on the Supreme Court to overturn qualified immunity. He wrote, the Supreme Court, quote, would likely prefer to Congress fix the problem. But, quote, from TikTok to the chambers of the Supreme Court, there is increasing consensus that qualified immunity poses major problems to our justice system. Again, I do not envy the task before the Supreme Court. Overturning qualified immunity will undoubtedly impact our society, yet the status quo is extraordinary and unsustainable. Just as the Supreme Court swept away the mistaken doctrine of separate but equal, so too should it eliminate the doctrine of qualified immunity, close quote. And this is not just in the South. I mean, Judge Reeve is based in the South, but this also is happening in our district court here in Utah. Judge Robert Shelby, who is currently the presiding district court judge in the state of Utah, recently rendered opinion in Harmon versus Salt Lake City. Harmon versus Salt Lake City involved a case back in 2017 where a Salt Lake City police officer shot and killed Patrick Harmon. This was in the news, and you may have seen it. He was an individual riding a bicycle, but while officers attempted to arrest him, Harmon began to flee on his bicycle, and Harmon eventually turned back towards the officers, got off his bicycle, and approached them with his hand raised to his chest. The shooting officer believed that Harmon had a knife and threatened to cut the officers. Judge Shelby's holding was that the officers were entitled to qualified immunity because a reasonable officer could have believed that Harmon posed an immediate threat. Although Judge Shelby dismissed the excessive force claim on qualified immunity grounds, he provided a disclaimer about the qualified immunity at the beginning of his opinion. Judge Shelby first addressed the facts of George Floyd's death and the protests about police brutality. This is straight from the opinion. Quote, Floyd's death came on the heels of numerous high-profile deaths of Black men and women in interactions with police officers in recent years. These events and others carried the Black Lives Matter movement into the mainstream and invigorated discussions and debate on a wide range of issues surrounding law enforcement and race, including calls in some circles to change the qualified immunity laws that this court must apply in this ruling. Because it would be inappropriate to do so, Judge Shelby continued, this court expresses no opinion whatsoever about the current protests, movements, counter movements, opinions, other cases around the country, the wisdom of current qualified immunity laws, or any other matters touching on important issues we are grappling with as a nation. So if there's so much criticism, then what is qualified immunity good for? Again, I talked about this, but I think, specifically in my line of work and in your line of work of risk management, when trying to defend claims, this is a very, very important defense, qualified immunity. It helps to protect government officials who are acting in good faith. Public officials, again, perform vital tasks that may require split-second decisions in stressful circumstances, and taking away qualified immunity could lead to officers or governmental officials being hesitant to act when it is most needed. In the case that set forth the doctrine of qualified immunity and what a reasonable officer would do with respect to the use of force, it's called Graham versus Connor. The Supreme Court talked about the fact that we shouldn't do Monday morning quarterbacking, where we look at an officer's actions, where they have to make a split-second decision and base our decision on 20/20 hindsight while we're sitting in the comforts of an office, or as the court said there, the judge chambers, or in the comfort of a courtroom. Officers and government officials must have room to make reasonable mistakes without worrying about being sued. Qualified immunity prevents government officials from standing trial, which saves taxpayer money and allows government officials to carry on with their job. Under qualified immunity, officers are still accountable if they violate clearly established rights. And again, we're talking only about money damages. Officers can still be charged criminally for their actions. However, again, with what's happening in our country, there's clearly a movement with the general public about qualified immunity. This was a study done by the Cato Institute, and it was a study done just this summer. And then the question was, is qualified immunity, I mean, the question here is whether qualified immunity is in danger. And in the study, 63% of Americans favored eliminating qualified immunity for the police, for police officers. And I think it's important that you look at the way the question was worded to the general public. It says, as you may know, qualified immunity protects police officers from being sued for misconduct unless there's a previous legal case with similar facts ruling that officers may not engage in that particular conduct. Would you favor or oppose eliminating qualified immunity so that police officers could be sued for misconduct even if there is no previous legal case with similar facts? And again, there they found, or the study found, that 38% strongly favored that, 26% somewhat favored it, 17% strongly oppose it, and 20% somewhat oppose it. So 63% were in favor of eliminating qualified immunity when presented that type of a question. The problem with that type of a question is that's not exactly correct. That's not what qualified immunity is. When it says that there's a previous legal case with similar facts, that is not 100% accurate. It doesn't have to be 100% similar facts. And as we'll discuss here in a minute, what the 10th Circuit has done is put together a sliding scale talking about whether if the conduct of the officer or the conduct of the government official that's asserting qualified immunity is so egregious, then you have to have a less specific case. And as the conduct of the government official moves to a more closer call of whether that conduct actually violates a constitutional right or statutory law, then at that point, the case that would need to be found by the plaintiff in trying to ward off qualified immunity needs to be more particular and needs to be more specific. So two possible ways that qualified immunity may be changed in our country is, first, the Supreme Court could overrule or make changes to it. And in knowing that, you need to know that there are two justices on the opposite ends of the political spectrum that within the last 5 years have been critical of the doctrine when writing dissenting opinions. Justice Sotomayor, the way stated in a dissenting opinion, Kiesla versus Hughes, back in 2008, that the way the court applies qualified immunity sends an alarming signal to law enforcement officers and the public. It tells officers that they can shoot first and think later, and it tells the public that palpably unreasonable conduct will go unpunished. Again, this was her dissenting opinion, and the decision from the Supreme Court was, a 7-2 decision. The facts in that case were that you had an individual woman who police were called to because this adult woman was having some type of mental break where she had a knife and she was trying to cut down a tree with a large kitchen knife and acting irrational. When they arrived, the officers arrived. The roommates of this woman was there by her side. She made multiple threatening gestures toward the woman. And at one point, finally, the officers used deadly force. And the issue was whether that was reasonable or not, whether they believed that the woman actually was going to kill the woman that was next to her. The woman that was next to her ultimately testified in a declaration that she was not afraid for her life, that her roommate had these type of actions before. But of course, the officers didn't know that. The woman actually wasn't killed in this situation, and so she was the one that asserted the 1983 claim. The bottom line is they were entitled to qualified immunity, and the Supreme Court focused in on what the officers knew when they arrived on the scene, not again 2020 if they would have been able to have a situation that was more stable and not a situation in which they encountered where the woman who was being threatened with a knife could have told them that she didn't feel threatened. Those weren't the facts, and they weren't the facts that the officers encountered at that time. Then on the opposite spectrum, you have Justice Thomas, and in a 2017 opinion, Ziegler versus Abbasi, he wrote a dissenting opinion in which he talked about his concerns with what common law at the time of the Civil Rights Act of 1871 said about immunities. And he specifically said that, quote, until we shift the focus of our inquiry to whether immunity existed in common law, we will continue to substitute our own policy preferences for the mandates of Congress. In an appropriate case, we should reconsider our qualified immunity jurisprudence, close quote. However, it's unlikely that the Supreme Court is going to just overrule in its entirety qualified immunity in the near future. Just this last session, or just this recently on June 15, 2020, the Supreme Court declined to take up a case that would have given it the opportunity to overturn or reform qualified immunity standard. And Justice Thomas was the only justice that dissented to say that he would have taken the case. The majority of the Supreme Court has consistently applied qualified immunity and really has not shown any signs of abandoning it. So the other option for reform of qualified immunity is through Congress. One idea in Congress is to end qualified immunity completely. Cory Booker, he said that ending qualified immunity would create a far greater level of accountability for police officers who violate someone's civil rights. On June 2nd of this year, the Ending Qualified Immunity Act was introduced. It was introduced by Reps. Justin Amash and Ayanna Press. Has 66 co-sponsors, 65 Democrats and 1 Republican. The bill basically states that qualified immunity can no longer be a defense to civil rights claims. There's also the Reforming Qualified Immunity Act that was introduced by Republican Senator Mike Braun from Indiana. The bill does not eliminate qualified immunity completely, but it reverses the clearly established prong. Again, that seems to be the prong that is the most hotly debated and the prong that the Supreme Court focuses in on what clearly established means. This bill, currently a plaintiff has to find precedent showing, that a defendant's specific actions violate the law, and this bill would make the defendant liable unless the defendant then would have the burden to show any case or statute authorizing their conduct and that they had a good faith belief that their actions were lawful. And it basically borrows from that original case that we talked about, Pearson versus Ray, and just adopts or borrows the good faith immunity standard. Other ways that policing and civil rights law are being impacted right now are through local reforms. And although local governments cannot amend qualified immunity, they can regulate their law enforcement officers. An example of this is here in Salt Lake City. Mayor Mendenhall signed an executive order recently requiring Salt Lake City Police Department Chief Mike Brown to implement several changes to the department's policies. Some of these reforms include use of force, where officers will be required to use de-escalation techniques unless it is unreasonable to do so before using force. Deadly force, and the policy change there is that it limits the use of deadly force, including only using deadly force when no other force will subdue the threat, and requires more supervisors to review every use of force incident. It also impacts search and seizures of law enforcement. It limits the scope and time of a search and requires written or recorded consent to search. And then it also talks, the policy changes talk specifically about body cameras, and the new change says that disciplinary action will be taken against officers who fail to activate their body cam. Reforming qualified immunity would impact more than just law enforcement, and I think that's something you need to take and keep in mind. Without qualified immunity, all government employees and employers would face greater exposure to liability. There's no longer would only the plainly incompetent be liable. And one area that could see a rise in claims is 14th Amendment equal protection claims related to workplace discrimination and sexual harassment. And so let's kind of switch gears here and talk a little bit about sexual harassment and equal protection claims. It's clearly established law that discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, and sex violate the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. Sexual harassment and other sexual misconduct also violate clearly established 14th Amendment principles. But the clearly established determination must be made at a proper level of specificity. Again, as I told you earlier, the 10th Circuit has what is called a sliding scale approach to the clearly established prong of what qualified immunity. And this is a quote from the case Wilson versus the City of Lafayette. And the opinion was authored by Justice Gorsuch, who was at that time on the 10th Circuit. He wrote, "The more obviously egregious the conduct in light of prevailing constitutional principles, the less specificity is required from prior case law to clearly establish the violation." Here's a case that I think gives you kind of a demonstration of the fact that this impacts not just police officers. The case is Aqua versus City of Altus. Hope I said that right. The facts of the case are as follows. The plaintiff was the city manager of the City of Altus in Oklahoma. He claimed that two city employees were actively discussing his religious affiliation with the city council and accusing him of favoring members of his church. Plaintiff even claimed that the employees were concerned about a Mormon mafia and that plaintiff was going to fire them and hire all Mormons. The employees likely shared their thoughts about the plaintiff with the mayor and other members of the city council, the court found, and the city council included the mayor, and they ultimately voted to terminate the plaintiff 6-3. Plaintiff filed a lawsuit claiming he was terminated based on his religion. The court denied qualified immunity to the mayor because discrimination based on religion was a violation of clearly established law. Again, this showing how the clearly established prong is applied in the 10th Circuit. However, plaintiff's employees were granted qualified immunity. It was not clearly established that non-supervisory employees without decision-making power could be held liable under the circumstances. So these were, employees under the city manager, and they were the ones that had allegedly brought this discussion to the city council and to the mayor. And again, they had been sued, but they were successful in asserting qualified immunity. The specific facts as applied to each defendant's situation made the difference between which defendants received qualified immunity and which defendants went to trial. The case that I'm currently handling for Miller County is Engstrom versus Corey. This is a Section 1983 claim against a volunteer firefighter for equal protection violations related to sexual harassment and assault that allegedly occurred at a fire station. This has been in the news. The fire chief at the time, again, this is a volunteer fire department for the town of Kanosh, at that time was also a sergeant in the Miller County Sheriff's Office. His son was the assistant fire chief. Unknown by these two individuals, the fire chief and the assistant fire chief, they both began a sexual relationship with one of the volunteer firefighters. That volunteer firefighter claimed that the assistant chief had sexually assaulted her for a 2-year period of time, and that she had reported that to the fire chief, who again she was, which is undisputed, that she was in an intimate relationship with, and that he had not followed through with that, in essence, disciplining his son, the assistant fire chief. And so the claim against the fire chief And his official capacity for Millard County and the claim against Millard County is that Section 1983 claim, asserting an equal protection claim in violation of the sexual harassment and assault that the volunteer firefighter is asserting. So that's the type of claim. Again, qualified immunity is a defense that we have asserted in this case, and we are waiting at this time for the criminal proceedings against the assistant fire chief to proceed and come to a conclusion before we move forward with the civil rights case. But qualified immunity is a defense that we can assert and have done so in that case. So in conclusion, qualified immunity is still good law. The appellate courts consistently apply and uphold this doctrine, and even judges who do not believe it is good policy know that they ultimately could be reversed on appeal if they don't apply qualified immunity. There may be some reforms in the future. I think this, obviously, you have two bills that have been introduced just this summer regarding reforming qualified immunity. But it's likely that qualified immunity will remain a valuable tool for defending against civil rights lawsuits. And it's important that if you believe it's a valuable tool that you would like to be able to have at your disposal in handling these type of disputes that we've talked about today, that you make your voice heard and that you have the opportunity to speak with those that represent you to make sure that they understand that you think qualified immunity is an important defense and a good tool to help shield municipalities and governmental entities from just becoming deep pockets that continually get sued without this type of a defense. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I've got a question that came in. Actually, a couple. Looks like a couple have come through. So the first one will be, what do you foresee the impact will be when state laws are amended to repeal qualified immunity, as they have done in Colorado?
So I always tell clients that the first place, if the case is filed, it includes federal claims, that we obviously look first to those federal claims, but then you have to look to the specific state law claims. And so states are enacting laws that will impact how use of force and how policing is looked at on the state level, but a state cannot overrule the qualified immunity doctrine in the federal system. And so, yes, that would allow state claims to survive, and there's discussion right now here in the state of Utah, specifically about the use of deadly force by law enforcement officers and changing the law with respect to that. And that would impact any type of state claim brought against a police officer. But again, the federal law would follow the 10th Circuit and United States Supreme Court precedent.
All right. Next question is, are you seeing the qualified immunity discussion is impacting settlement considerations by insurers?
Yes, I mean, I've seen it. It's obviously impacting our federal court. There are judges that have made there are judges in Utah that have made it be known that they're not fans of qualified immunity, and judges that have concerns about qualified immunity. Again, as I said just a minute ago, I'm the president-elect for the Federal Bar Association Utah chapter, and we will be putting on a CLE, which is separate from the BYU Law School CLE that I just told you about a minute ago. A CLE this Thursday, actually, on qualified immunity that Judge Neufer asked us to put on in light of Judge Reeves' decision and Judge Shelby's decision. I know that Judge Neufer is one judge that has expressed some concerns about qualified immunity. I know that Judge Waddups has as well, and because of the concerns that some of our local, federal judges have expressed, I have seen that impact settlement discussions, because the doctrine still has to be applied by a judge. And if a plaintiff knows that a judge has concerns about the doctrine, they can use that to their advantage in discussing settlements and trying to get leverage.
All right, and finally, a question on how does gross negligence fit into this picture?
So gross negligence is a more of a tort principle, and it has gross negligence. You usually see claims being asserted with respect to gross negligence on the state side. When you're asserting a Section 1983 claim, a federal claim where qualified immunity would apply, you're not talking in essence about negligent. You're talking that a statutory law has been violated or a constitutional right. So gross negligence really doesn't have any kind of implication with respect to the analysis of qualified immunity, while it does have implications with respect to the analysis of state claims and whether the Utah Governmental Immunity Act would apply.
All right, well, thank you so much, Blake. Really appreciate you taking some time with us this morning.
Well, thank you for having me. And if anyone has any further questions, or if they would like to, like I said, participate in other discussions about this important legal doctrine and defense that they have, there's going to be a CLE presented by the Federal Bar Association this Thursday. That notice will be sent out. If they want to know how they can attend that, they can contact me. And also BYU's Law School is also going to be putting on a presentation about this with Judge Reeve as the keynote speaker regarding that presentation. Or if they have questions, I'd be happy to answer those as well. So they can just simply contact me.
Well, thank you so much, Blake. It has been very enjoyable to hear your summary and the excellent presentations today. With that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up the risk conference for today. We want to remind any members of the Utah Bar that CLE credit is available for today's sessions. By signing in at riskconference.net, today's webcast will also be available to review if you happen to have missed any of the sessions. The second part of the risk conference will begin on Thursday morning, which is September 17th at 9 a.m. And we look forward to everyone joining us again in 2 days. We've enjoyed our time together by means of webcast, and once again, look forward to a day when we can all be together in person, but appreciate everyone being part of the webcast today. And with that, we'll plan on seeing you on Thursday. Thanks.